Margaret Ellis counted the bills in her palm for the third time, as if the number might change if she just looked hard enough. $15. 3 fives, crumpled and soft from being folded and unfolded in the pocket of her father's old jacket during the 4-hour drive from the house she no longer had the right to enter. $15 and a Honda Civic with 213,000 miles on the odometer and a tank of gas that the dashboard told her would last another 97 miles, and a daughter sleeping in the passenger seat with her cheek pressed against the cold window and her breath fogging the glass in small, quiet puffs. That was everything. That was her life now, at 41 years old, reduced to a number you could count on one hand and still have fingers left over. The parking lot of the truck stop outside Redding Falls, Nebraska, was nearly empty at 4 in the morning. A single sodium lamp buzzed overhead, throwing yellow light down on the cracked asphalt and the oil stains that looked like dark continents on a map of somewhere nobody wanted to go. Margaret sat with both hands on the steering wheel even though the engine was off, because if she let go, she didn't know what her hands would do, and she had a feeling it might involve breaking something, or maybe just shaking so hard she couldn't stop. Lily was 11 years old. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn chin, and right now she was curled up with her backpack for a pillow, wearing the pink sweatshirt Margaret had bought her for her birthday 2 years ago when the sleeves had still been too long. Now they barely covered her wrists. Everything in their car, everything in the world that still belonged to them, fit into the trunk and the back seat. 2 duffel bags. 1 cardboard box of books. Lily's stuffed rabbit, missing an eye. A framed photograph of Margaret's mother at 25, smiling in a yellow dress, dead for 16 years now, and the only person in Margaret's family who had ever looked at her without deciding something was wrong with her first. The reading of the will had happened 3 days ago. Margaret could still smell the lawyer's office, leather polish and old paper, and the sharp mint of her brother Daniel's cologne, which he had worn since he was 17 and which she had always associated with the way he said her name, like it was a problem he was about to solve by throwing it away. The house had gone to Daniel. The investment portfolio had gone to Daniel. The property up near Silver Ridge had gone to Daniel. The bank accounts, the rental properties, the silver, the china, the oil paintings their grandmother had brought from Virginia, all of it, in one sweeping breath from the lawyer's dry throat, had gone to Daniel. To Margaret, her father had left $15 and a note. She hadn't read the note yet. It was folded in her wallet, pressed against the 3 $5 bills like they were keeping each other company. She knew she would have to read it eventually, but not yet. Not while her father's voice could still be reconstructed in her head if she tried hard enough. Not while the shape of him in her memory still had edges and depth. Whatever was in that note would sand him down, and then he would be gone, really gone, and Margaret would be alone in a way she had not been alone before. Daniel had smiled at her across the lawyer's desk. A small, private smile, the kind you give someone when you've won a game they didn't know you were playing. "You'll manage, Maggie," he'd said. "You always do." He'd said it like a compliment. He'd said it like a dismissal. He'd said it the way their father had said it for 40 years, ever since Margaret had been 8 years old and had broken her arm falling off the garden wall, and their father had looked at her sitting on the grass holding the bone that was bent in a way bones weren't supposed to bend, and he'd said, "Stop crying. You'll manage." And she had stopped crying, and she had managed. She had walked into the kitchen and told her mother quietly that she needed to go to the hospital, and she had not cried, not once, even when the doctor set the bone. 41 years of managing. 41 years of being the one who didn't need things, who didn't ask for things, who figured it out, who made do, who smiled and said it was fine when it was not fine. And all of that managing had led her here, to a truck stop parking lot in Nebraska, with $15 and a daughter and 97 miles of gas. She let go of the steering wheel. Her hands did not break anything. They just shook a little, and then they folded themselves in her lap, and she watched them until they stopped. The divorce had taken what little she had built. Peter had not been cruel, exactly, but he had been the kind of man who always came out ahead, who had a way of making his own carelessness look like her failure. And when the marriage ended, the lawyer fees had been his, the house had been his, and the savings they had built together had somehow, through arrangements Margaret still did not fully understand, been his also. She had walked away with a daughter and a car and a part-time bookkeeping job at a dental practice that had closed 6 months later when Dr. Patel retired. She had moved back in with her father because there was nowhere else to go. That had been 2 years ago. For 2 years, she had cooked his meals and done his laundry and driven him to his appointments and sat with him through the long nights when his breathing had started to fail. And Daniel had called twice a month from Denver to ask how the old man was holding up, and had visited exactly 3 times in 24 months, and had somehow ended up with everything. Margaret was not bitter. She had decided, sitting in the lawyer's office, that she was not going to be bitter, because bitterness was another thing she couldn't afford, and she was already running a deficit on the things she couldn't afford. But she did need a place to sleep that wasn't a Honda Civic. And she did need to feed her daughter something that wasn't a bag of pretzels from the truck stop vending machine. And she did need, very badly and very soon, to figure out what came next. The bulletin board was inside the truck stop, near the bathrooms, next to a vending machine that sold disposable razors and travel packets of aspirin. Margaret had gone in to use the restroom and to splash cold water on her face, and she had stopped on her way out because a piece of paper on the bulletin board had caught her eye, and she couldn't at first understand why. It was a handwritten flyer, the kind of thing you wrote yourself with a thick black marker on a piece of printer paper and tacked up in the hopes that somebody crazy enough might see it. Trailer for sale. Rusted, run down, still standing. $10 or best offer. Comes with half-acre lot. Must pick up. Serious inquiries only. There was a phone number at the bottom. The area code was local. The handwriting was shaky, like someone older, or someone in a hurry, or someone who hadn't expected anyone to call. Margaret stood in front of the bulletin board and read the flyer 3 times. $10. She had $15. She read it a 4th time, and she started laughing, quietly, because the alternative was crying. And she had long ago made peace with the fact that laughter and tears were the same thing once you'd been reduced below a certain line. She laughed until her shoulders shook, and then she pulled the flyer down off the bulletin board, and she folded it in half, and she put it in her pocket with the 3 $5 bills, and she walked out to her car. Lily was still asleep. The sky was starting to lighten in the east, a thin gray band above the horizon that made the sodium lamp look suddenly pathetic. Margaret sat in the driver's seat and pulled out her phone, which had 1 bar of service and 13% battery, and she dialed the number. It rang 6 times before anyone answered. Yeah. The voice was old, gravelly, the kind of voice that had been through a lot of cigarettes and a lot of winters. I'm calling about the trailer, Margaret said. The one in the flyer. At the truck stop. There was a long silence on the other end. Long enough that Margaret thought maybe she had the wrong number, or maybe the man on the other end had died between rings. Then he said, "You sure?" "I'm sure. It's not pretty, ma'am. I'm not looking for pretty." Another long silence. Then, "You got a truck?" "I have a Honda." The man laughed, a dry cough of a laugh that turned into an actual cough, and then back into a laugh. "Well, hell," he said. "Come on out, then. I'll give you the tour. You'll probably run in the other direction, but you're welcome to try. Name's Harlan. 4417, Muddy Creek Road. You got a pen?" Margaret didn't have a pen. She repeated the address out loud 3 times to fix it in her memory, and then she said, "Thank you." And she hung up, and she sat for a moment with her hands on the steering wheel and her eyes closed, and she thought about her mother in the yellow dress, and she thought about the 97 miles of gas, and she thought about the note in her wallet she hadn't read yet. She woke Lily gently, with a hand on her shoulder. "Sweetheart," she said, "we're going to go look at something." Lily opened her eyes slowly, confused, still half in whatever dream she had been having. "Where are we?" "Nebraska. We're still in Nebraska. Go back to sleep if you want. I'm going to drive a little ways." "Are we going home?" Margaret swallowed. Her daughter was 11 years old. Her daughter had already had to say goodbye to a house in Iowa, and then a house in her grandfather's town, and now she was asking if they were going home, and Margaret had no answer that wouldn't be a lie. "We're going to find somewhere to stay," Margaret said. "Just for a little while. Until I figure out what comes next." "Okay." Lily nodded and closed her eyes again. She was a good kid. She was too good, sometimes, in ways that hurt Margaret to watch. The way a child gets good when they have figured out that complaining makes the adults in their life sad and tired. Lily had gotten good at being no trouble. Margaret hated that about the world she had given her daughter, and she hated that she couldn't yet give her anything better. Muddy Creek Road was 11 miles from the truck stop, down a two-lane blacktop that turned into gravel halfway there, and then turned into something more like a rumor of a road than an actual one. Margaret drove slowly, afraid of the Honda's suspension, afraid of the tires, afraid of everything. The sun came up over the fields on her left, soft and pink, and for a moment the land looked beautiful. Great flat stretches of harvested corn and raw earth and wire fencing that ran all the way to the horizon. The address, when she found it, was marked by a lopsided metal mailbox with the number half scratched off, and a long dirt driveway that curved through a stand of dead-looking cottonwood trees. She turned in. The trailer came into view slowly, section by section, like something being revealed from behind a curtain. It was bad. It was worse than the flyer had promised. It was a single wide, maybe 40 feet long, the kind of thing that had probably been white at some point in the 1970s, but was now the color of tea stains and rust. Half the skirting around the bottom was gone, and what was left hung in crooked strips like torn paper. The windows were there, but two were boarded over with plywood, and one was cracked down the middle. The front door was canted on its hinges. The roof had a blue tarp thrown over one corner, weighted down with cinder blocks, and the tarp itself was faded and split. Around the trailer, the lot was half an acre of scrubby grass and broken concrete, and what looked like the rusted hulk of an old washing machine dumped in the weeds. A chain-link fence ran along one side, topped with a wild rose bush gone feral, and standing on the cement block step in front of the door was a man who had to be Harlan. He was shorter than Margaret had expected, and older, in his 70s maybe, with a cap pulled low and a plaid flannel shirt buttoned wrong, and a cigarette held loosely between two fingers that had clearly held a great many cigarettes over the course of a long life. He watched her pull up, and when she stopped the car and got out, he touched the brim of his cap the way men his age had been taught to do when they were boys. "You the Honda," he said. "I'm the Honda," Margaret agreed. "And this is the trailer." He gestured with his cigarette hand, not at all embarrassed. "Ain't much to look at." "No. You still want the tour?" "Yes, please." He squinted at her. "You don't look like the kind of person who buys something like this." "I don't know what kind of person buys something like this." "Neither do I." He laughed again, the same dry cough laugh as on the phone. "But come on. I'll show you anyway." He led her inside, and Margaret followed, and Lily stayed in the car with the doors locked because Margaret had told her to, and Margaret stepped over the threshold of the crooked door and into the dim interior of a trailer that smelled like mildew and old cigarette smoke, and something else underneath it, something sweet and dusty, like cedar, maybe, or old books. The inside was not as bad as the outside had suggested, and in some strange way, that was worse, because it meant somebody had lived here, really lived here, and the evidence of that life made it feel less like a ruin and more like a place that had been abandoned. A small kitchen with a two-burner stove, the enamel chipped. A living area with a bench seat along one wall, the cushions flattened. A narrow hallway. A bedroom at the back, and a bathroom the size of a closet. The carpet was the color of dirt and had patches where it had been worn through to the subfloor. The wallpaper, what there was of it, was a yellow floral print from another decade, peeling at the seams. The ceiling had water stains in 3 different rooms, but the walls were solid. The floor didn't bounce under Margaret's weight. The stove, Harlan assured her, still worked, as long as you didn't mind lighting the pilot yourself with a match. There was a well on the property, and a septic tank, and a propane tank around the back that was about a quarter full. "It's 150 feet off the county road," Harlan said. "Electric is cut off right now, but the line is still good. Power company'll turn it back on for a deposit. $50, I think. Well, pump runs on a separate circuit." "Why are you selling it for $10? Harlan took a long pull on his cigarette and considered her. He had blue eyes, faded but still sharp, the kind that had watched a lot of weather come in across a lot of fields. "It was my sister Edna's," he said. "She lived here 41 years. Died last spring. Cancer. No kids, no husband, nothing. Left everything to me, and I got my own place 2 counties over, and I don't need this, and I can't sell it for real money because nobody in their right mind wants it. County's gonna put a lien on it for back taxes if I don't get it off my hands by spring. $800 I owe on it. So I figure I sell it cheap, whoever buys it takes the tax bill, and I'm out from under it. $10 is just so we can say money changed hands, and it's legal." Margaret stood in the dim kitchen and did math in her head. $800 in back taxes. She had 15. She would need electricity, propane, food, gas for the car, a way to earn enough to pay the taxes before the county took the trailer back. It was impossible. It was absolutely, obviously impossible. And it was also more of a roof than she had half an hour ago. "I'll take it," she said. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. His cigarette had burned down almost to the filter, but he didn't seem to notice. "You got a kid in that car, don't you?" he said. "I do." "How old?" 11. He nodded slowly. "My sister was 11 when our mother died. She took it hard. She never really got past it. That's part of why she lived here alone all those years." He dropped the cigarette on the linoleum floor and ground it out with his heel, and it occurred to Margaret that this was his house, still, and he could do what he wanted. "Tell you what, ma'am. How about I tear up the back taxes? My lawyer can handle it. I'll pay what's owed out of Edna's estate. You give me your $10, and it's yours, clean. I'll sign the title over right here, right now. I got it in the truck." Margaret stared at him. "Why?" "Because I don't want to sell a trailer to a woman with an 11-year-old kid in a Honda with busted struts and watch her lose it to the county 6 months from now. I got enough on my conscience, ma'am. I don't need that on top of it." Margaret's throat closed. She had not cried in the lawyer's office. She had not cried through any of the things her brother had said to her over the past week. She had not cried when she had driven away from her father's house with all of her possessions in the back seat. She had been saving her crying for later, for when she had the time and the privacy and the strength to afford it. But now, standing in a ruined trailer on Muddy Creek Road, with a stranger in a plaid shirt offering her something for no reason at all, she felt the careful wall she had been holding up start to crack. "Thank you," she said. It came out small. Harlan looked at his boots. "Don't thank me yet. Wait till you live here a winter. Then we'll see if you still feel like thanking me." They did the paperwork in the kitchen, on a folding TV tray that Harlan had brought in from his truck. The title was a single sheet of paper, and Harlan signed it with a ballpoint pen, and he made Margaret sign too. And then he shook her hand and gave her a set of 3 keys on a ring, and he told her that the biggest one was for the front door, and the second biggest was for a padlock on the storage shed around the back, and the smallest one was for something he'd never figured out. Might be for a drawer. Might be for a suitcase. Edna had that key on her ring forever, and I never asked her what it was for. Figured once she was gone, it'd tell its own story, or it wouldn't. He handed her the $10 of change out of her 15, because he insisted she take the 10 back, said the deal was for $10, and the $10 was just symbolic, and he wasn't going to take money from a woman with a kid in the car. And then he got in his truck, and he drove down the driveway, and Margaret stood in the yard in front of her trailer and watched him go, and she held $5 in her hand instead of 15. And she owned a home. She owned a home. It was not a good home. It was barely even a home. But it was hers, and her daughter could sleep in it tonight, and nobody could take it away without a fight that would take months and months, and that was, measured against where Margaret had been 6 hours ago, something like a miracle, even if it was a miracle dressed in mold and rust. She went back to the car and woke Lily up again. "Baby," she said, "I want to show you something." Lily rubbed her eyes and sat up. She looked at the trailer through the windshield, and she was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret watched her daughter's face carefully, because she had to know, right now, how bad this was going to be. Lily looked at her mother. "Is that where we're going to live?" "For a little while," Margaret said. "Just until I figure out what comes next. I know it doesn't look like much." Lily was quiet again. She was 11, and she was smart, and Margaret could see her daughter taking in the broken windows and the sagging roof and the rust and the weeds, and doing the child math that children do when they figure out how bad things have gotten. Then Lily unbuckled her seatbelt. "Can I see inside?" she asked. "Yes. Yes, of course." They got out of the car together, and Lily held her mother's hand, and they walked up the cement block steps and through the canted door, and Margaret watched her daughter take a slow tour of the little kitchen and the living area and the narrow hallway and the small bedroom at the back. When Lily was done, she came and stood next to her mother, and she looked up at her. "Is it ours?" she asked. "Yes." "Like really ours? Nobody can make us leave?" "Nobody can make us leave." Lily nodded, thinking about it. Then she said, "I like the window in the bedroom. It looks out at trees." And that was when Margaret, finally, after everything, sat down on the dirty linoleum floor of the trailer she had bought for nothing, and she pulled her daughter into her lap, and she cried, quietly, the way she had learned to cry, because even now she could not bring herself to really let go. But she cried, and Lily held her, and that was the first minute of the next part of Margaret Ellis's life. They slept that night on the bench seat in the living area, which folded down into something like a bed if you pulled out the wooden frame beneath it. Margaret gave Lily both of the blankets they had in the car, and she wrapped herself in her father's jacket, and they lay curled together and watched the unfamiliar shadows move across the ceiling as a thin moon rose outside the window that wasn't boarded over. The trailer was silent in a way Margaret had forgotten existed. No traffic, no neighbors, no hum of a refrigerator because there was no electricity. Just the wind in the cottonwood trees, and once, far off, a dog barking. Lily fell asleep first. Margaret lay in the dark with her 11-year-old daughter breathing against her shoulder, and she let herself feel everything she had been holding back for 3 days. Her father was dead. Her brother had taken everything. She had $5, a car that was probably dying, a trailer that was definitely dying, and no job and no plan and no safety net. And winter was coming, and she was 41 years old, and she had no idea what she was going to do. But she also had a roof. Tonight, right now, she had a roof, and her daughter was sleeping under it. And that was something her father had not left her, and that was something her brother could not take away, and that was something she had found on a bulletin board next to a vending machine selling aspirin. And she had found it because she had kept her eyes open even when every other part of her had wanted to close. Maybe, Margaret thought, that was all life was, in the end. Keeping your eyes open. Refusing to stop looking, even when looking was the hardest thing in the world. She fell asleep thinking about the note in her wallet, the one from her father, the one she hadn't read. She dreamed about her mother in the yellow dress. In the dream, her mother was sitting on a porch Margaret didn't recognize, and she was sewing something. And when Margaret asked her what she was making, her mother smiled and said, "You'll see, sweetheart. You'll see it when you need to." The first week in the trailer was a war against filth and small disasters. Margaret drove into town on the second day with her last $5 and spent 3 of them on a bottle of bleach and a roll of paper towels and a packet of sponges from the dollar store. And she spent the next 72 hours scrubbing. She scrubbed the kitchen. She scrubbed the bathroom. She pulled back the carpet in the bedroom and scrubbed the subfloor beneath. And she found, tucked under the baseboard, a dry cluster of pressed flowers wrapped in tissue paper that fell apart when she touched it. She thought of Edna, the sister who had lived here 41 years. A woman who pressed flowers and tucked them into corners of her home. A woman who had lost her mother at 11 and never quite gotten past it. Margaret felt Edna's presence in the trailer like a quiet companion, not a ghost, exactly, but a kind of residue of a life. Something in the walls and in the dust, and in the way the windows were arranged to catch the afternoon sun. She went to the power company on the 4th day and paid the deposit in installments, because she had enrolled in a state assistance program that morning and had been approved for a small emergency stipend. The woman at the power company, a tired-looking woman in her 50s with a name tag that read Doreen, took one look at Margaret and told her she'd make it work, and the lights came on in the trailer that evening. 1 weak bulb in the kitchen and 1 in the hallway and 1 in the bedroom. And Lily clapped her hands when they flickered to life. "We have lights," Lily said, like it was a marvel, which it was. The rest of the week went like that. Small miracles and small disasters, in more or less even proportion. The toilet backed up, and Margaret learned how to snake a drain with a coat hanger, which was a thing she had not known she could do. The propane tank ran lower than Harlan had said it would, and Margaret rationed the hot water and learned to take the kind of brief, cold-edged showers she had taken as a child at summer camp. One of the windows that wasn't boarded over had a crack that let in a thin whistle of air, and Margaret covered it with plastic wrap and duct tape from the kitchen drawer. Lily enrolled in the local elementary school the following Monday. The school was a 1-story brick building in Redding Falls with a single American flag on a pole out front, and the principal, a short woman named Mrs. Kowalski, had looked at Margaret's paperwork and at Lily's face and had said, gently, "We'll make sure she has what she needs, ma'am. Don't you worry about that." Margaret had almost cried again, right there in the office, because she was worn down to a level where kindness cut deeper than cruelty ever had. Margaret took a job waiting tables at the diner on Highway 11, a place called the Blue Bird, which was painted, against all reason, brown. The tips were bad, but they were cash, and cash was what she needed, and the manager, a gruff man named Earl who chewed toothpicks, let her work the 6 to 2 shift so she could be there when Lily got off the school bus at 3:15 at the end of the driveway. It was not a life she had chosen. It was a life she had landed in, The way you land after falling a long way, bruised and out of breath, and surprised to still be in one piece. But it was a life. It was hers. It had walls around it, even if the walls were crooked and the paint was peeling. And the neighbors noticed. Oh, the neighbors noticed. The first one to drive out to the trailer was a woman named Pauline, who lived 3/4 of a mile down the road in a neat double-wide, with a vegetable garden and a statue of the Virgin Mary by the front steps. Pauline was in her 60s, tightly permed, and she showed up on the third Saturday with a casserole dish and a smile that was mostly teeth. "I heard someone bought poor Edna's place," Pauline said, handing over the casserole. "I said to myself, Pauline, you better go over there and welcome them. So here I am." "Thank you," Margaret said. "That's very kind." Of course. Pauline's eyes swept over the trailer, the yard, the car with its mismatched hubcap, the blue tarp on the roof. "Of course, honey. And you're here with just your daughter? No husband? Just us? Oh, bless your heart." Pauline's voice went soft in the way that Margaret had learned to recognize as the particular regional dialect for "let me tell you something condescending. Just the two of you in this little old place. Well, you know, if you need anything, you just come find me. And I'll be honest with you, sweetheart, because I was raised to be honest. This is not a long-term situation, is it? This trailer? You must have something else lined up." "I don't actually." Pauline blinked. "You don't?" "No." "Well." Pauline took a small step backward. "Well now, I'm sure you'll figure something out. Folks always do." She left the casserole. She did not come back the next weekend. The word spread. Margaret could tell by the way people looked at her in the aisles of the grocery store, by the way the other waitresses at the Blue Bird smiled at her with a pity that had teeth in it. She was the woman who had bought Edna's old trailer. She was the woman with the kid, the broke one, the one who was going to fail. Everybody, in a small town, has a role, and Margaret's role had been assigned to her before she had even unpacked her box of books. Earl, the diner manager, called her into the back office on her second week and asked her, not unkindly, what her long-term plan was. Margaret told him she didn't have one yet. Earl nodded and told her that was fine. Everybody's entitled to figure it out at their own pace. But he also told her that the Blue Bird wasn't exactly a career, if she knew what he meant, and that she might want to start thinking about what came after this. Margaret thanked him. She did not tell him that she thought about what came after this every single second of every single day, and that the not knowing was a thing like a wire wrap tied around her lungs, and that sometimes in the middle of the night she woke up and she couldn't breathe for the not knowing, and she had to go stand in the little bathroom and splash water on her face and tell herself in the mirror, quietly, "You're going to figure this out. You have to figure this out. There is no one else who is going to figure it out for you." She read the note on a Wednesday night, 3 weeks into her life on Muddy Creek Road, after Lily had gone to bed. She sat at the kitchen counter under the single-week bulb, and she unfolded the piece of paper, and she read what her father had written to her. "Maggie, I know this will come as a hurt to you. Your brother has been my partner in the business since he was 20, and he has built more of what we have than you know. The house and the accounts have to go to him because the business cannot be split. You were the best daughter I could have asked for, Maggie. You were the kindest of us. But you don't need what Daniel needs, and I have tried to give what I had to the one who would use it most. I hope you understand. I love you. Your father." Margaret read it 3 times. Then she folded it back up and put it in her wallet again. She did not cry. She did not throw the note away. She did not call her brother and scream at him, even though for a moment she wanted to so badly that her hand actually lifted from the counter toward the phone. She just sat, under the weak bulb in the crooked trailer on Muddy Creek Road, and she understood something that she had been avoiding understanding for 41 years. Her father had loved her. Her father had never seen her. Those two things could coexist, and they did coexist, and he had died and left her $15 and a note that confirmed both of them, and there was nothing to do about that now except keep getting up in the morning. She thought about the small key on the ring Harlan had given her, the one he had said might be for a drawer or a suitcase or something nobody had ever figured out. She had put the key in a coffee mug on the kitchen counter, and she had forgotten about it for 3 weeks, but now she got up and took it out of the mug and held it in her palm. It was small and brass and old. It had an uneven little tooth on one side, like a filing had taken a nick out of it years ago. She turned it over in her fingers and thought about Edna, the woman who had carried this key on her ring for however long, never using it, never throwing it away. Margaret began, that night, to look. She looked in every drawer in the kitchen. She looked in the bathroom vanity. She looked in the bedroom closet and found a single wire hanger and a dust bunny the size of her fist. She looked under the bench seat in the living area, and she found, in a compartment she hadn't noticed before, 3 old Reader's Digest magazines and a folded receipt from a hardware store dated 1987. She did not find anything the small key fit, but she had started looking. And in the weeks that followed, she did not stop. The storage shed behind the trailer was a small metal structure that had once been painted green and was now mostly rust. Margaret had unlocked it her first week with the second biggest key on the ring, and she had taken one look at the disaster inside and closed the door again and not thought about it since. It was full of junk. Boxes of old National Geographics and stacks of magazines tied with twine and broken pieces of furniture and a lawn mower with the engine block missing and a Christmas tree stand and 3 unopened cans of paint from 1994. But on the first cold Saturday in November, with Lily at a birthday party for a girl from her class, Margaret went back out to the shed. She stood in the doorway and she looked at the piles of junk, and she thought, I am going to go through every single thing in this shed before winter hits, because maybe there is something in here I can sell, and because I need to understand what this place is, and because Edna put these things here for a reason, and because somewhere in this mess might be whatever that little brass key fits. She worked for 4 hours that Saturday. She worked for 6 hours the Saturday after that. She carried boxes out into the weak autumn sun and opened them one by one in the yard, and most of what was inside was trash, but some of it was not. Some of it was Edna's life, preserved in cardboard. There were photo albums, dozens of them, going back to the 1950s. Black and white pictures of a little girl with her hair in pigtails, standing next to a woman in a dress and a man in a hat, all 3 of them squinting in the sun. There were diaries, small ones, the kind with locks that had rusted away long ago. There were letters, tied in bundles with ribbon, from people named things like Eleanor and Ruth, and somebody named only M, who had written in a tight, slanted hand for almost 10 years before stopping abruptly in the spring of 1974. There were objects. A ceramic teapot shaped like a chicken, missing the lid. A collection of glass insulators from old telephone poles, the kind people used to collect in the 70s. A shoebox of old postcards, postmarked from places like Asheville and Boise and Albuquerque. And underneath all of it, at the very back of the shed, pushed up against the wall behind a broken dresser and a roll of damaged carpet, was a wooden trunk. Margaret saw it on the 3rd Saturday of cleaning. She had to move the dresser and the carpet and a box of mason jars to reach it, and by the time she stood in front of it, she was sweating even in the November cold, and her back hurt from lifting, and she had a splinter in her left thumb the size of a grain of rice. The trunk was old, really old, maybe 100 years. It was made of dark wood, scarred and scratched, with 2 leather straps buckled across the top, and a brass hasp in the front with a brass padlock hanging from it. The padlock was small, smaller than a normal padlock, small enough that a small brass key might fit it. Margaret stood in the dim back of the shed and looked at the trunk and felt something move in her chest, something she had not felt in a very long time, something that might have been curiosity, or might have been hope, or might have been the kind of low animal instinct that tells you, right here, right now, pay attention. She went back to the trailer, and she got the small key from the coffee mug on the kitchen counter, and she brought it back to the shed, and she knelt in the dust in front of the old wooden trunk, and she slid the small brass key into the brass padlock, and she turned it. The padlock opened with a soft, almost inaudible click, like a breath being let out after a long time held. Margaret sat back on her heels. Her heart was doing something fast and strange in her chest. She pulled the padlock off the hasp, and she unbuckled the 2 leather straps, and she lifted the lid of the trunk. And what she saw inside made her stop breathing entirely for a moment, because it was not what she had expected to find, and it was not what she had hoped to find, and it was, instead, something so much stranger than either that her mind could not immediately process what it was looking at. The trunk was lined with faded blue velvet, stained in patches but still soft to the touch, and arranged on top of the velvet, in rows as careful as soldiers in a parade, were dozens of small objects wrapped in yellowed tissue paper. Not jewelry, not money, not what she would have guessed, in her wildest guessing, she might find at the bottom of a forgotten wooden trunk in a stranger's abandoned storage shed. Instead, What Margaret saw was objects, small ones, shaped like bundles, like parcels, like secrets that had been put to bed a long time ago and never woken up. She reached in and picked up the one nearest her. It was heavier than she expected for its size, maybe the weight of a deck of cards, and when she began to unwrap it, the tissue paper crumbled in her fingers as if it had been holding its shape only by habit. Beneath the tissue was a small cloth pouch, tied with a piece of green ribbon. Margaret untied the ribbon with slow hands. Inside the pouch was a stack of what looked, at first, like old photographs. Small ones, the size of playing cards, with scalloped edges. She held one up to the dim light coming through the shed doorway, and she saw that it was not a photograph at all. It was a painting, tiny and detailed, done on what looked like ivory or bone, showing the face of a young woman with dark hair pinned up and a high lace collar. A miniature, she thought, the word coming to her from some old history class she had sat through in 7th grade. A portrait miniature. People used to give them to each other as love tokens in the 1800s, before photography was widespread, when painting someone's face tiny enough to carry in a pocket was the most intimate thing you could do. The woman in the little painting had sad eyes. Not angry, not tragic, just sad in that patient, permanent way that some faces have, as if the sadness had become so much a part of her that it no longer moved. On the back of the miniature, in a faded pencil hand, was written a single word: Mother. Margaret sat in the dust of the shed floor with the tiny painting in her palm, and she thought, this is not mine. This does not belong to me. This belongs to whoever loved this woman, and to whoever that person loved, and to whoever carried this little painted face through however many generations of hands. It was Edna's trunk, and Edna was dead, and Edna had no children and no husband, and the trunk had been abandoned in the back of a shed, and now it was, as a matter of brute legal fact, Margaret Ellis's trunk. But that did not feel right. That did not feel like the whole story. She set the miniature carefully aside on a square of clean newspaper, and she unwrapped the next bundle. This one contained a watch. A pocket watch, gold, with a chain. The case was engraved with initials that Margaret could not at first read in the dim light, a tangled knot of cursive letters. She rubbed the face of the watch with her sleeve, and the crystal was cracked down the middle, but the hands were still there, frozen at some hour long past, and when she pressed the small button on the side, the back cover popped open, and there was an inscription inside the case in a neat engraved hand. To J.E., on the occasion of his 50th. From the firm. 1887. Margaret sat with the watch in her hand for a long moment. 1887. That was 137 years ago. The watch was 137 years old, and it had been sitting in a trunk in a shed in Nebraska in rural silence, and now she was holding it, and she did not know what to do with it, because she did not know what it was worth, or who J.E. had been, or how the watch had come to be in Edna's possession in the first place, or why, if it was valuable, no one had ever sold it. She thought, very clearly and very quietly, perhaps nobody knew this was here. She thought, perhaps Edna did not even know what she had. The light was going in the shed. The sun was setting somewhere behind the cottonwood trees, and the temperature was dropping, and Margaret could see her breath now when she exhaled. She had to go. Lily would be home from the birthday party in an hour. She could not leave all of this out in the cold, unprotected, with the lid of the trunk open to the dust. She gathered the tissue paper and the ribbon and the little painting of the sad-eyed woman and the cracked gold pocket watch, and she placed them all carefully back inside the trunk, and she closed the lid, and she buckled the 2 leather straps, and she snapped the brass padlock closed again, and she dropped the small brass key into the pocket of her jeans. She did not open any of the other bundles. Not yet. She stood, her knees aching from kneeling so long, and she looked at the trunk in the back of the dim shed, and she felt, for the first time since her father had died, something that was not fear and not grief and not numb endurance. She felt a question, a real one, the kind of question that has a pulse. What else was in that trunk? Whose lives had passed through these objects before ending up here, wrapped in tissue, in a dark wooden box, in a shed, on a half-acre lot she had bought for $10 that had been handed back to her. She went back to the trailer and she locked the shed behind her, and she stood on the cement block steps in the cold, and she watched the last light go out of the Nebraska sky, and she thought about her mother in the yellow dress, and she thought about her father's note in her wallet, and she thought about her daughter who would be home soon. And she thought about Edna, who had lived here 41 years and pressed flowers and kept a trunk full of wrapped objects in the back of a shed and never told anyone. Lily's bus pulled up at the end of the driveway at 5:40, and Margaret walked down to meet her, and when Lily ran toward her in the fading light, her pink sweatshirt bright against the gray evening, Margaret pulled her into a hug that was maybe a little tighter than usual. "Mom," Lily said, "you're squishing me." "Sorry. Are you okay?" Margaret thought about that. She held her daughter at arm's length and looked at her, at the dark hair and the stubborn chin and the eyes that were her mother's and Margaret's and Lily's own all at once. "I think I might be," Margaret said. "I think I might actually be." They walked back up the driveway together, and Lily talked about the birthday party and the cake and a boy who had put an ice cube down another boy's shirt, and Margaret listened and laughed and held her daughter's hand, and in her other pocket, the small brass key sat warm against her thigh, and she could feel it there, solid and real and waiting. Whatever was in that trunk, she did not yet know, but she was going to find out. Margaret did not open the trunk again for 6 days. She told herself she was being patient. She told herself she was being careful. But the truth was simpler than either of those things, and the truth was that she was afraid. She was afraid that if she opened the trunk again and unwrapped the other bundles, she would find something that would change her life, and she was afraid that she would find something that would not. Both possibilities frightened her, in different ways, and she needed 6 days to understand which fear was the real one. The waiting was not easy. The trunk sat in the back of the shed like a low hum in the air of her life, a note she could hear even when she was not listening for it. She would be scrubbing a counter at the Blue Bird at 7 in the morning, and she would think about the pocket watch with the cracked crystal. She would be driving Lily to school, and she would think about the little painted face of the woman who had been called, by someone, mother. The watch, the miniature, the unknown bundles still wrapped in tissue. They followed her everywhere, quiet and patient. On the 6th day, a Friday, Margaret took her lunch break at the diner and drove the 11 miles home with a sandwich still in its wrapper on the passenger seat. It was her day off from the late shift at the gas station she had taken on the week before, a second job that paid $3 an hour above minimum wage and came with a discount on propane, which had mattered more to her than anything. She had an hour before she needed to be back at the Bluebird. She had a daughter who would not be home from school until 3:15. She had nothing in the trailer but a sandwich and a reason. She went out to the shed. The November light was thin and hard, the kind of light that makes everything look scraped clean. She unlocked the shed door and pushed it open, and the cold inside was sharper than the cold outside. She moved the broken dresser and the roll of damaged carpet and the box of mason jars again, the way she had before, and she knelt in front of the trunk in her waitress uniform with her name tag still pinned over her heart, and she unlocked the padlock with the small brass key, and she unbuckled the 2 leather straps, and she opened the lid. The bundles were exactly as she had left them. Little soldiers in a parade, wrapped in crumbling tissue, waiting. She took them out one by one, and she unwrapped them on a square of clean newspaper spread across her knees, and the shed around her went still in a way that felt almost watched, as if the piles of junk and the rusted lawn mower and the broken Christmas tree stand had all leaned in to see what would happen next. The third bundle contained a stack of letters, tied in a ribbon the color of dried violets. Not the letters from Eleanor and Ruth that she had found in the earlier boxes. These letters were older, the paper brittle, the ink so faded in places she could barely read it. The top envelope was addressed in a man's hand to Mrs. James Everton, Albany, New York, and it was postmarked 1891. Margaret's hands were suddenly too clumsy for her. She set the bundle down carefully on the newspaper and did not untie the ribbon. Not yet. Those letters were 133 years old, and whatever was inside them was a conversation she was not ready to overhear. The fourth bundle was heavier. When she unwrapped it, a long fold of dark blue fabric fell into her lap, and nested inside the fabric was a necklace. Not costume jewelry, not something from a thrift store. A real necklace, with a chain that was delicate and tarnished and a pendant that was a single stone set in what looked like gold, the stone deep green and smooth, and about the size of her thumbnail. It caught the thin November light coming through the shed door and held it, turning it slowly into something that was not quite green and not quite any other color Margaret had seen before. She did not know what the stone was. She had never owned a real piece of jewelry in her life beyond her wedding ring, which had been a thin gold band that Peter had bought on credit and which she had mailed back to him in a padded envelope the week the divorce was finalized. She knew nothing about gems. She did not know if the stone in her lap was a real emerald or a piece of colored glass or something else entirely, something she could not even name. But she knew, holding it, that it did not feel like glass. Glass did not have weight like this. Glass did not take light and turn it into something with a pulse. She set the necklace on the newspaper next to the bundle of letters, and she kept unwrapping. The fifth bundle was a small leather-bound book with a silver clasp. A diary, or something like one. The pages, when she opened it carefully, were filled with tight handwriting in pale brown ink, and at the top of the first page was a date, June the 4th, 1889. She did not try to read the entries. She closed the book gently, as if it might crumble. The sixth bundle was a pair of men's cufflinks, engraved with the same initials as the pocket watch, J.E. The seventh was a velvet pouch of what looked like uncut stones, small and rough, that might have been anything or nothing. The eighth was a stack of documents, folded and yellowed, that Margaret recognized from their format as old stock certificates, the kind with engraved borders and ornate typography, made out in names she did not recognize for companies she had never heard of. Pennsylvania Anthracite and Reading, Great Plains Mercantile Bank, Hoffman and Crane Importers, dozens of them, stacked and tied and forgotten. She was 10 bundles in, with the open trunk half empty in front of her, when she realized her hands were shaking, and that she had been holding her breath for longer than she should have been, and that she was going to be late getting back to the diner if she did not stop now. She looked down at what she had unwrapped on the spread of newspaper across the shed floor. A miniature painting, a gold pocket watch, cracked, a stack of Victorian love letters, a green stone on a tarnished chain, a leather diary from 1889, a pair of cufflinks, a pouch of rough stones, a stack of stock certificates from companies that had almost certainly not existed in 100 years. She thought, carefully, deliberately, I have no idea what I am looking at. She thought, this could be nothing. This could be costume jewelry and photocopies and a bundle of old paper that some long-dead aunt thought was meaningful and nobody ever bothered to throw out. She thought, this could also not be nothing. And then, for the first time since she had opened the lid of the trunk, she felt something that had a small sharp edge to it, something like a warning. Because if this was something, if any of it was something, then it had been sitting in a shed for decades, in a trailer for decades before that, and nobody had ever looked at it with eyes that understood what they were seeing. Nobody had sold it. Nobody had cashed it in. It had been kept. Not hidden, exactly. Kept. She thought Edna knew, or someone before Edna knew, and they chose to keep. She wrapped everything up again, more carefully this time, in the crumbling tissue and the faded ribbons. She closed the lid of the trunk. She buckled the leather straps. She locked the brass padlock with the small brass key. But this time, when she stood up, she took 2 of the objects with her. The pocket watch, because the engraved date was specific enough that she might be able to find out what it was, and one of the stock certificates, picked at random from the top of the pile, because she wanted to know if the company on the paper had ever been real. She put them in the glove compartment of the Honda, and she drove back to the Blue Bird, and she made it to her shift with 2 minutes to spare, and for the rest of that afternoon, she carried plates of eggs and pancakes to truckers and old men and a young couple in matching denim jackets. And inside her chest there was a small, hard, bright thing she had not felt in years, and that thing was curiosity, and curiosity, she remembered, was dangerous, because curiosity was the first cousin of hope. And hope was the most expensive thing a person with $5 in her wallet could possibly afford. That night, after Lily went to bed, Margaret sat at the kitchen counter with the pocket watch and the stock certificate and her daughter's school laptop, which Mrs. Kowalski at the elementary school had loaned her for the semester because Margaret did not own a computer. The kitchen was cold. She had a blanket around her shoulders. The single-week bulb overhead buzzed quietly. She looked up the stock certificate first. Pennsylvania Anthracite and Reading. She typed the name into the search bar, and she waited while the slow internet connection at the edge of the county loaded the results. The first thing that came up was a historical society page. Pennsylvania Anthracite and Reading had been a railroad and coal company founded in 1873, absorbed into a larger conglomerate in 1898, and liquidated in 1923. The certificates, according to the page, were considered worthless as securities because the company had not existed in any legal form for over 100 years. But, the page said in a smaller paragraph further down, original uncancelled certificates from Pennsylvania anthracite and reading were highly collectible among a subset of historical paper enthusiasts, particularly certificates from the first issue of 1873, and particularly those signed by the company's founding treasurer, a man named Jeremiah Everton, because Jeremiah Everton had been a minor but well-documented figure in Gilded Age finance. Depending on condition and signature, a first-issue certificate could sell for anywhere between $800 and $6,000 at auction. Margaret looked down at the certificate in her hand. It was a first issue. The date on it was 1873. At the bottom, in faded black ink, was a signature. She could not make it out in the weak light, but she could see that it was a long, tangled signature, and she could see that it ended with a loop that could have been a Y, which could have been the last letter of the name Jeremiah. She thought, $800 to $6,000. For one piece of paper. She had a pile of maybe 40 pieces of paper in that trunk. She could not do the math because she did not want to do the math. She was a woman who had grown up watching her father get angry at her mother over a $10 grocery overspend, and the numbers she was looking at did not belong in the trailer on Muddy Creek Road. She closed the browser tab. She did not look up the watch. Not yet. She was not ready. She sat in the cold kitchen with the blanket around her shoulders, and she listened to the wind in the cottonwoods outside, and she thought about a woman named Edna, who had lived here 41 years, and who had died of cancer in a hospital 2 counties over, and who had left no will, and no children, and no husband, and whose brother Harlan had signed the trailer over to a stranger for $10 in tears. Edna had not known. Margaret was almost certain, now, that Edna had not known. The trunk had been inherited, probably, from her parents, or her grandparents, or some aunt further back, and it had sat in the shed for 41 years unopened, because the key had been on Edna's ring, but Edna had never found whatever drawer or box the key went to, and because Edna had grown up the kind of person who did not poke around, who did not pry, who kept things the way she had found them because that was what had been asked of her. Margaret understood Edna, at that moment, in the cold kitchen. Margaret had been that kind of person for a long time. She had kept things the way she had found them. She had not pried. She had not poked. She had swallowed her questions and carried her small key on a ring through her life without ever trying the locks. And then her father had died, and her brother had taken everything, and she had landed with her daughter in a rusted trailer on a half-acre lot, and she had started looking, and she had started trying keys, because there was nothing left to keep in place. She thought, quietly, maybe this is what my father meant. Maybe not. Probably not. But maybe. Maybe what he had left her was not $15. Maybe what he had left her was the need to go find her own locks. She turned off the laptop and she went to bed, and she lay next to her sleeping daughter under the 2 blankets and the old jacket, and she did not fall asleep for a very long time, because her mind kept turning and turning, and the cold did not help, and outside the wind in the cottonwood trees sounded like somebody far away was whispering something she was supposed to hear. The winter settled in hard over the next 3 weeks. Snow came twice, once in a dusting and once in a storm that dropped 9 inches on Muddy Creek Road and left the Honda buried to the hubcaps. Margaret learned to shovel. Lily learned to shovel too, in a red coat 3 sizes too big that Pauline had dropped off one afternoon without coming in, just left on the steps with a note that said, "For your girl, cold is cold." Margaret had been embarrassed, and then grateful, and then embarrassed again for having been embarrassed, and she had written a thank you note that she was afraid to deliver and had left on her counter for a week. Lily was thriving at school. That was the surprise Margaret had not been expecting, the surprise that kept surprising her. Her daughter, who had moved twice in 18 months and lost her house and her grandfather and most of her world, had somehow found, in the little brick building in Reading Falls, a set of teachers who liked her and a group of 5th-grade girls who did not care that she lived in a crooked trailer on a half-acre lot. Lily came home with drawings and homework and stories about a kid named Jonah who ate glue sticks on a dare, and she laughed at the dinner table over ramen noodles, and she slept deeply at night, and Margaret watched her daughter and thought, maybe the poverty had stripped something away that had needed to be stripped. Maybe losing everything had, paradoxically, given Lily something her old life had not. Margaret did not dare say any of this out loud. She did not want to jinx it. She was still a woman who crossed her fingers when she walked past ladders and who said, "Knock on wood," without irony. But at night, when her daughter was sleeping, Margaret went back to the laptop. And over the course of 3 weeks, in the slow hours between 10 and 1 in the morning, she taught herself enough about the things in the trunk to be dangerous. She learned that the pocket watch, based on the engraved case and the 1887 date, was probably made by a firm called Waltham, and that the initials J.E. were almost certainly Jeremiah Everton, the same Jeremiah Everton who had signed the stock certificates. She learned that Jeremiah Everton had been a Brooklyn-born businessman who had made and lost several fortunes between the Civil War and the turn of the century, and who had died in 1903, and whose descendants had scattered and thinned out over the following 120 years in the way that families do when there is nothing to hold them together. She learned that the portrait miniatures like the one she had unwrapped had been painted, most often, by itinerant artists in the mid-19th century, and that an intact Victorian miniature in good condition, with a clear provenance, could sell at auction for anywhere between $2,000 and $15,000. She learned that the stone on the tarnished chain, if it was what it appeared to be, was an emerald, and that emeralds of that size, in a Victorian-era setting, were the kind of thing that made auction house specialists lean forward in their chairs. She learned, slowly, that the thing in her shed was not a trunk of keepsakes. It was a small private museum of the Everton family, somehow preserved across 4 or 5 generations, ending up, by some accident of inheritance or marriage or distant cousinhood, in the possession of a woman named Edna who had not known, and a brother named Harlan who had not known, and finally a stranger named Margaret who had driven 11 miles down a gravel road on her last $5. It was, if it was genuine, a lot of money. Margaret did not know how much. She was afraid to guess. The numbers she kept finding when she researched were large enough to be unreal, and she had been burned by unreal numbers before, in the last years of her marriage, when Peter had kept promising that next month would be better and next month never was. She did not want to believe in a number that might not be there. So she made a plan. A small, cautious, Margaret Ellis plan. The kind of plan a woman makes when she has been burned often enough to know that every single step has to be placed carefully on the ground before you trust it. Step 1. She would find an expert. Not a local pawn shop. Not a man who would look at what she had and see only a desperate woman and a quick buck. A real expert. The kind who worked for real auction houses. The kind who would tell her the truth because his professional reputation depended on telling the truth. Step 2. She would not tell anyone about the trunk until she had that expert's assessment in writing. Not the neighbors. Not the women at the Bluebird. Not her brother. Especially not her brother. She did not trust what Daniel would do if he knew. She was not sure, yet, what she would do if she knew, and until she was sure, she was going to hold this close. Step 3. She would, when the time came, do the thing her father and her brother had never taught her to do. She would spend money carefully, and she would save money ruthlessly, and she would make every single dollar earn its place. She had been poor long enough to know how to be poor well. If she was going to be not poor, she was going to be not poor well, too, because she had watched her brother be rich badly her whole life, and she did not intend to follow him. But first, the expert. She found one in Omaha, on the website of a regional auction house called Prairie Heritage Auctioneers. A man named David Chun, specialist in Gilded Age memorabilia and American ephemera. His photograph on the website showed a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses, sitting at a desk with a book open in front of him. His biography was short. MFA in Art History from the University of Chicago. 24 years in the auction business. Published 3 monographs on 19th century American financial documents. She wrote him an email. She kept it brief. She said she had come into possession of a small collection of family items from the late 19th century, including a pocket watch, a stock certificate, a pendant, and a miniature portrait. She said she did not know if any of it was of value. She said she would be willing to drive to Omaha to have them looked at, and she gave her phone number. She sent the email at 11:17 on a Wednesday night. David Chin replied at 8:14 the next morning. Mrs. Ellis, happy to take a look. When would you like to come in? She drove to Omaha the following Saturday. Lily stayed with a girl from her class whose mother, a woman named Rebecca, had become the first real friend Margaret had made in Reading Falls. Rebecca did not ask questions. Rebecca, who had once been a social worker before marrying a farmer and moving out to the county, had a nose for when a woman was carrying something heavy, and she had looked at Margaret the first time they had met, and she had said, gently, "You let me know if you ever need a Saturday," and Margaret had cried in the parking lot of the elementary school. Afterward for 3 full minutes before she had been able to drive home. Omaha was 3 hours away. Margaret drove with the pocket watch and the first stock certificate, and, after 2 days of agonizing, the emerald pendant wrapped in a handkerchief in the pocket of her father's old jacket. She left the miniature and the letters and the diary at home, locked in the trunk in the shed. She was not going to carry everything at once. She did not trust the car, and she did not trust herself, and she did not yet trust David Chun, even though his photograph had a kind face. The auction house was in a converted warehouse on the edge of the old meatpacking district. Margaret parked on the street and walked in with her handkerchief-wrapped bundle in her purse, and she gave her name to a young woman at the front desk, and she waited on a leather couch under a framed poster advertising an estate sale from 1998. David Chun came out to get her himself. He was shorter than she had expected, and quieter, and his handshake was firm but not showy. He led her back to a small room with a wooden table and a bright lamp and a pair of white cotton gloves laid out on a cloth. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, "please, sit down. You said on the phone you have several items." "I have 3 today. I have more at home." "At home where?" "Redding Falls. It's 3 hours west." 3 hours. David Chin looked at her with a polite professional interest that did not yet contain judgment. "And you drove 3 hours to see me today?" "Yes." "May I ask why not somewhere closer?" Margaret had rehearsed this answer. "Because I don't know what I have, and I want someone honest to tell me. And you've been published in journals I found online, and you've worked in this business a long time, and I thought that you would tell me the truth even if the truth was that I have nothing." David Chin nodded slowly. He pulled on the white cotton gloves. "All right," he said. "Let's see what you've brought." Margaret took out the stock certificate first, because it was the item she felt most sure about, the one whose provenance she had already researched. She laid it carefully on the cloth on the table. David Chin leaned over it. He looked at it for a long time, without touching it. He examined the paper, the engraving, the signature, the watermark. He took a magnifying glass out of a drawer beside him and looked at it again, slowly. "This is a first-issue certificate from Pennsylvania Anthracite and Reading," he said, not looking up. "The signature is Jeremiah Everton's. It is uncancelled. The paper is in remarkable condition. Where did you get this, Mrs. Ellis?" "I inherited it." "From whom?" "From a woman named Edna. Her brother signed over the property I was living on. Everything inside came with it, including a trunk." David Chin looked up at her. "There is more. There is more." He put the certificate down very carefully. He took off his glasses, cleaned them with a cloth, put them back on. "Show me the other items." Margaret put the pocket watch on the cloth. Then she unwrapped the handkerchief and placed the emerald pendant next to the watch. The 3 objects sat on the clean cloth under the bright lamp, and they looked, all at once, like what they were. Pieces of a life. A life that had ended a long time ago, and whose leftover pieces had somehow found their way through a century of forgetting into the small, careful hands of a specialist in Omaha, Nebraska. David Chun did not speak for a full minute. He examined the watch, the signature on the back, the cracked crystal. He examined the pendant, holding it up to the light, turning it slowly. He pulled a small instrument from another drawer, a jeweler's loop, and he looked at the stone through it. When he put the loop down, he was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Ellis, I am going to ask you a question, and I would like you to think carefully before you answer it." "All right. You mentioned that there is more at home. In a trunk. How much more?" Margaret hesitated. She thought about her plan, about being cautious, about not trusting too fast. But David Chun was looking at her with a kind of controlled stillness, the stillness of a man who has spent 24 years in the auction business and who knows when something is happening. And she could see, in that stillness, that he was being truthful with her, that he was not going to try to cheat her, that he was, for reasons of his own professionalism and dignity, incapable of pretending that what he was looking at was less than it was. "There are," she said slowly, "a lot more items in the trunk. I think maybe 20 bundles. Wrapped in tissue. I have only opened a few." David Chin closed his eyes briefly. Then he opened them. "Mrs. Ellis, the watch is worth approximately $6,000 to $8,000 at auction. The certificate, depending on signature verification, which I am fairly certain will be positive, is worth approximately $4,000. The pendant. He paused. The pendant I will need to have authenticated by a gemologist, but my initial assessment, based on the cut, the setting, and the weight of the stone, is that it is a natural Colombian emerald of approximately 4 carats, in a period setting that is itself a significant piece of jewelry history, and that its auction value is somewhere between $60,000 and $120,000. Margaret stared at him. Her mouth was open. She closed it. That is, David Chun continued calmly, for 3 items. You have just told me there are approximately 20 more bundles in a trunk in a shed in Redding Falls, Nebraska. Yes. Mrs. Ellis. Yes. I think, David Chun said, very carefully, that we need to talk about what happens next. I think I need to come and see the rest of this collection in person, as soon as possible. I think you need to secure what you have, because the numbers we are talking about are significant enough that they will attract attention if they become known. I think you should not discuss this with anyone outside of the people you trust most completely. And I think, he said, and now something almost gentle came into his voice, that whatever has happened in your life to bring you to this point, Mrs. Ellis, has brought you to a point where the next few months are going to be very, very unusual. Margaret sat in the small room with the bright lamp and the clean cloth and the 3 objects glittering under the light, and she heard herself say, in a voice she did not recognize as her own, Mr. Chun, I am a waitress. I live in a trailer I bought for $10. I have a daughter. I have $5 in my wallet right now, plus whatever I made in tips yesterday. I don't know what to do. David Chun folded his gloved hands on the table. Mrs. Ellis, he said, neither of us knows what to do yet, but I am going to help you figure it out. Not because I am a kind man, although I hope I am. Because you have walked into my office with the largest single find of Gilded Age Everton family memorabilia that has ever crossed my desk in 24 years, and because my professional reputation depends on me treating you fairly, and because if I can be the specialist who brings this collection to market correctly, my career will be changed by it. So we are, as of this moment, working together. If you want to. Margaret thought about Lily. She thought about the trailer. She thought about her father's note and her brother's smile and the $15 she had counted in her palm in the parking lot of the truck stop. She thought about the woman in the miniature, the sad-eyed woman whom someone had called mother. She thought about Edna, who had lived 41 years in a single wide and had never known what was in her own shed. She thought, finally, I am not going to be Edna. I want to, Margaret said. David Chun nodded once, a small, definite nod. Then, he said, let's begin. The drive home from Omaha took 3 hours and 17 minutes. Margaret did not remember most of it afterward. She drove through the darkening Nebraska afternoon with the pocket watch and the stock certificate and the emerald pendant back in her purse, wrapped in the handkerchief, and inside her chest there was a sound like water rushing, and her hands on the steering wheel were steady, but her legs were not, and twice she had to pull over onto the shoulder of the interstate because her eyes kept blurring. And the blurring was not from tears but from something else, something more like shock, a kind of systemic disbelief that her body was trying to process and couldn't. She picked up Lily from Rebecca's house a little after 8 in the evening. Rebecca took one look at her face and said, quietly, Are you all right? I'm all right. I'm just tired. Long drive. You want coffee before you go home? The girls are watching a movie. Lily can stay another hour. It's no trouble. Margaret wanted coffee. Margaret wanted to sit in Rebecca's warm kitchen under the yellow overhead light and tell her friend everything. Margaret wanted to say the words out loud, because until she said them out loud, they did not feel real, and if they were not real, she was going to come apart. But she did not. She thanked Rebecca, and she gathered up her daughter, and she drove home to Muddy Creek Road, and she put Lily to bed, and she sat alone at the kitchen counter in the trailer with the 2 weak bulbs burning overhead, and she took out David Chin's business card, and she read it over and over, as if the words on it might change if she looked away. David Chun, Prairie Heritage Auctioneers. Specialist, American Ephemera and Gilded Age Memorabilia. She thought, $60,000 to $120,000. For one necklace. She thought, 20 more bundles. She thought, I cannot tell anyone. Not yet. Not until I know for sure. She thought, Daniel must not find out. And then, much later, in the cold kitchen, with the wind in the cottonwoods outside and her sleeping daughter on the other side of the wall, she thought, very quietly, "I am going to be okay." For the first time in her 41 years of life, Margaret Ellis allowed herself, for one single moment, to believe it. David Chin drove out to Redding Falls on the Tuesday after Thanksgiving. Margaret had agonized for 5 days about whether to invite him, and in the end she had decided that the risk of him seeing the trailer was smaller than the risk of not knowing what she had. She had cleaned the trailer as if the Pope were coming. She had swept the single wide from end to end, and she had scrubbed the kitchen counter until the laminate almost shone, and she had even pulled down the yellow floral wallpaper in the smallest stretch by the bedroom door, because it had been peeling so badly it had begun to feel like a personal failure. Under the wallpaper was plain drywall, cracked in one place, and Margaret had patched the crack with a tube of spackle from the dollar store and painted it with a test-size can of white paint that had cost her $2.60. And the small square of fresh white wall looked so clean and intentional that it made the rest of the hallway look worse, and Margaret had laughed out loud at herself, alone in the trailer, for the first time in months. She had not told Lily. Lily knew that a man named Mr. Chun was coming to look at some old things, because Margaret did not believe in keeping big things completely secret from 11-year-olds. But she had told her daughter only that the old things had belonged to the woman who had lived in the trailer before them, and that Mr. Chun was helping her understand if any of them were worth anything. She had said it in the careful, measured voice she used when she was managing Lily's expectations, and Lily, who was clever, had given her mother a sideways look and had said, "Okay, Mom," and had not asked further questions. But that evening, Lily had drifted into the living area where Margaret was washing the dinner dishes, and she had stood with her shoulder against the wall, and she had said, in a voice that was not quite casual, "Is it a lot, Mom?" And Margaret had stopped with her hands in the soapy water, and she had turned, and she had looked at her daughter, and she had said, "I don't know yet, baby. But maybe." And Lily had nodded, and she had gone to her bedroom, and she had not brought it up again. David Chun arrived at 11 in the morning in a dark gray sedan that looked almost comical in the driveway next to the Honda. He stepped out in a wool coat and leather gloves and the same wire-rimmed glasses from his photograph, and he looked at the trailer, and he looked at the shed, and he looked at the flat Nebraska sky over both of them, and his face did not change at all, which Margaret appreciated. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, "thank you for having me out. Come in. I have coffee." He followed her into the trailer, and he sat at the kitchen counter where there was no proper table, and he drank the coffee she poured him, and he asked her about the drive from the truck stop where she had found the flyer, and he asked her about Harlan, and about Edna, and about what she knew of the provenance of the objects. He took notes in a small leather-bound book with a fountain pen, and his questions were careful and patient, and Margaret found that the talking helped, because it shaped the story into something she could hold, rather than something that was happening to her. After the coffee, they walked out to the shed together. David Chin stood in the doorway of the cluttered shed, and he looked at the piles of junk and the rusted lawn mower and the broken dresser, and he said, very quietly, almost to himself, "Of course it was here. Of course." "What?" "I'm sorry. A thought. Please, Mrs. Ellis, show me the trunk." She showed him. She moved the dresser and the roll of carpet and the box of mason jars, and she knelt in front of the trunk, and she unlocked the padlock with the small brass key, and she opened the lid. David Chun, who had been quiet and professional all morning, drew in a small, audible breath. Then he knelt down beside her. He pulled on his white cotton gloves. He looked at the bundles and their crumbling tissue and their faded ribbons, and he said, in a voice that was nearly tender, "May I?" "Please." He worked for 4 hours. Margaret brought him a second cup of coffee, and then a sandwich at lunch, which he ate without looking up from the cloth he had spread across the shed floor. He unwrapped every bundle, one at a time, and he photographed each object with a small camera he had brought in a padded case, and he wrote in his leather book, and he laid the objects out in a careful grid across the cloth, and the grid grew and grew until it filled almost the whole clean rectangle. There were, in the end, 23 bundles. 23 objects, or small groups of objects, that had been wrapped and placed in the trunk at some point in the late 19th or very early 20th century and had not been unwrapped since. The final inventory, as David Chun read it aloud to Margaret from his leather notebook while they stood together in the cold shed at 3 in the afternoon, went like this. 1 Waltham pocket watch, gold, engraved, dated 1887. One portrait miniature on ivory, probable subject Eliza Everton, mother of Jeremiah, dated circa 1850. One emerald pendant in period gold setting, approximately 4 carats. One set of men's cufflinks, gold, engraved. One velvet pouch containing 12 small rough sapphires, probable Ceylon origin, pre-cut. One leather diary, 1889, believed to be the personal diary of Jeremiah Everton himself. One bundle of 31 personal letters, dated between 1887 and 1891, between Jeremiah Everton and his wife Margaret Everton. At this, David Chun had paused, and he had looked up at Margaret Ellis, and he had said, quietly, "It is a common name, but it is a coincidence worth noting." He had continued, 47 stock certificates, various companies, first and second issue, all uncancelled, many signed by Jeremiah Everton in his capacity as founding officer. 3 promissory notes, bearer instruments, dated 1889, total face value at issue $18,000, which in today's money he estimated at roughly $600,000, though their present legal status would need to be investigated. One small silver snuff box, engraved. One carved ivory fan, broken at 2 ribs. One collection of 9 political campaign ribbons from the presidential elections of 1876 through 1896 in unusually fine condition. One small leather case containing 6 mourning jewelry pieces woven from human hair, Victorian, intact. One folding map of Brooklyn, 1888, annotated in pencil. One last bundle, at the very bottom of the trunk, wrapped in a piece of black silk, containing a small revolver with an ivory grip, unloaded, with a box of 6 cartridges from a manufacturer that had gone out of business in 1923. David Chin closed his notebook. He stood up slowly. His knees cracked. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, "I am going to say something to you that I do not say often, because in my profession we are trained to hedge, always, because we have been burned by exuberance more times than I can count. But I am going to say it anyway, because you deserve to hear it plainly. This is the most significant private collection of Gilded Age Everton material that I am aware of in the United States. The Everton family has been, for over 100 years, a minor mystery in the field of Gilded Age finance, because Jeremiah's business papers were thought to have been scattered or destroyed after his death, and his family descended into obscurity in the first decades of the 20th century. What you have here, in this trunk, is not just objects of individual value. It is a primary source. It is an archive. The letters alone, if they are what I believe they are, will interest universities and historians for decades." Margaret stood in the cold shed with her arms wrapped around herself. She was wearing her father's jacket again, and the small key was in her pocket, and her breath was visible in the air in front of her. "What does that mean?" she said. "In money. Because I have to ask. I'm sorry." "You never have to apologize for asking, Mrs. Ellis. My preliminary estimate, based on what I have seen today, is that the collection in aggregate is worth somewhere between $800,000 and $1.6 million at auction. I am being conservative. I believe the final number will be higher, particularly once the letters in the diary are authenticated and cataloged, because the scholarly value will drive a premium. But I am not going to promise you anything. I am going to tell you what I am fairly sure of. 60 to 100,000 on the pendant, 6 to 8 on the watch, 40 to 60 total on the stock certificates, 4 to 6 on the miniature. The diary alone, to the right institutional buyer, could bring 100 to 200,000. And I have not yet looked carefully at the promissory notes or the sapphires." Margaret did not say anything. She could not, for a moment, have said anything if her life had depended on it. She stood in the cold shed and she looked at the 23 objects laid out on the clean white cloth across the dust of the shed floor, and she understood, for the first time, that what she had found was not an accident that was going to go away, and that she was not going to wake up tomorrow and discover it had all been a miscommunication. This was real. This was her real life now. "Mr. Chun," she said, and her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "I am going to need your help. I am going to need a lot of help. I don't know what any of this means. I don't know how to do any of this. I am a waitress. I will pay you for your time. Tell me what to do." David Chin nodded. He was still holding his leather notebook, and now he tucked it under his arm, and he took off his white cotton gloves, and he folded them neatly and put them in his coat pocket. And then he looked at Margaret with the kind of seriousness she had rarely received from anyone in her life. "You are going to do 4 things," he said. "First, you are going to secure these items properly. I will arrange for a certified art transport company to come to this property, with security and with insurance, and move the entire trunk and its contents to a climate-controlled facility in Omaha under my custody. We will do this within the week. Second, you are going to retain a lawyer, not a local lawyer. A lawyer in Omaha or Lincoln who handles estates and intellectual property and high-value auction transactions. I will give you 3 names. Third, you are going to authenticate the provenance. This will involve working with researchers who will trace the line of inheritance from Jeremiah Everton through his descendants to the woman named Edna, and from Edna to you. This is critical, because if any living descendant has a claim on this material, we need to know now, not at auction. And fourth, you are going to continue to live your life as if nothing has changed. Do not tell anyone. Do not quit your job. Do not buy anything you cannot explain. Do not, under any circumstances, talk about this with family members, with neighbors, or with anyone who has not signed a confidentiality agreement. Not until we know what we have. And not until the auction process is legally underway, which will take 6 months to a year. 6 months to a year. Yes. And during that time, I keep waiting tables. You keep doing exactly what you are doing now, Mrs. Ellis. Because that is the only way to make sure this ends the way it should end. If word gets out prematurely, we will have every collector and every con artist and every distant relative in the country showing up on your doorstep. We do not want that. What we want is a quiet, thorough, professional process, and at the end of it, an auction that is covered by the national press and attended by serious bidders, and you walking away with a result that changes your life. Margaret stood in the shed, and she thought about waiting 6 months. She thought about waking up at 5 in the morning every day and driving to the Blue Bird and smiling at truckers while she carried plates of eggs. She thought about doing that for 6 more months, with this knowledge in her chest. With this secret. She thought, I can do that. I have done harder things. I have done harder things for worse reasons. All right, she said. I'll do it. David Chin smiled for the first time since she had met him. It was a small smile, but it was real, and it transformed his face into something warmer than his professional distance had let her see. Mrs. Ellis, he said, I have one more question for you. Yes. Why is your daughter's school laptop sitting on your kitchen counter when it is a school day? Margaret blinked. Because the principal lent it to me. I don't own a computer. David Chin nodded. He reached into an inside pocket of his coat, and he pulled out a plain white envelope, and he handed it to her. This is an advance, he said. $2,000. Against the eventual commission. It is completely standard for an auction house to provide an advance to a consignor in a case of this significance, because the consignor will have expenses, legal fees, transport, a decent computer, perhaps a coat for your daughter that fits her properly. Margaret took the envelope. Her hand did not shake, but it wanted to. I can't. You can. It is not a gift. It is against future earnings. You will repay it out of the auction proceeds, with interest calculated at 2% above prime. I will have the paperwork drawn up and sent to you by the end of the week. Please sign it and return it. And Mrs. Ellis, please use the money, not for luxuries, for the basic dignity of your life and your daughter's life during the months this process will take. Please. Margaret held the envelope in her hand, and she looked at David Chun, and she thought, this man is being kind to me, and he is being kind in a way that protects his professional interests, and those two things can both be true at once, and that is okay, because people can be many things at once, and that is okay. Thank you, she said. You are welcome. They walked out of the shed together. David Chun locked the padlock on the trunk, and Margaret locked the shed door behind them, and they stood for a moment in the cold Nebraska afternoon, and David Chun looked up at the pale sun and down at the blue tarp on the roof of the trailer and across the scrubby half-acre lot, and he said, almost to himself, I will tell you something, Mrs. Ellis. I have been in this business for 24 years. The collections come from strange places. Attics, safety deposit boxes, once a grain silo in Illinois. But they all come from somewhere that looks, at first, like nowhere. That is one of the things I have learned. What looks like nothing can contain everything. You just have to be the person who opens the box. I almost didn't, Margaret said. But you did. Yes. David Chin nodded. Then he got into his gray sedan, and he drove away down the driveway. And Margaret stood on the cement block steps of the trailer with $2,000 in her hand, and she watched his car disappear down Muddy Creek Road, and she did not go inside for a long time. She stood in the cold, and she breathed, and she tried to get her heart to slow down, and she failed, and eventually she just gave up on that and let her heart do what it was going to do. That night, after Lily went to bed, Margaret sat at the kitchen counter with the envelope in front of her, and she did not open it. She did not need to. She knew what was inside. She thought about Edna, about a woman who had lived 41 years in a single wide and had pressed flowers into the baseboards and had kept a trunk she had never opened in the back of a shed. She thought about how easy it would have been for Edna to have been the one to find all of this, and she thought about how Edna had not, and she thought that maybe, in some small and crooked way, Margaret was going to have to live enough for both of them now. Because Edna had waited, and Margaret had not, and the difference was simply that Margaret had been pushed to a place where she had nothing left to lose, and Edna had never been pushed that far. The poor, Margaret thought, often know things the comfortable do not. And one of the things the poor know is that you cannot afford to stop looking. You cannot afford to assume the shed is full of junk. You cannot afford to leave the trunk closed just because you have always left it closed. Because something about being pushed to the edge of everything teaches you that every locked thing in your life might have a key, and every shed might have a trunk, and every trunk might have a bundle, and every bundle might be the thing that changes you. She put the envelope in the coffee mug on the counter, next to the small brass key. She went to bed. She slept, for the first time in weeks, all the way through the night. And in the morning, when she woke up, she got dressed, and she drove Lily to school, and she drove herself to the Blue Bird, and she carried plates of eggs and pancakes to truckers for 8 hours, and she smiled. And she said thank you when they tipped her, and inside her chest there was a small, hard, bright thing, and that thing had a name now, and the name was not curiosity anymore, and it was not even hope, exactly. The name was waiting, because Margaret Ellis, for the first time in her 41 years of life, had something to wait for. The transport company came on a gray Thursday morning in early December. 2 men in dark jackets, driving an unmarked white van with reinforced panels and a small discreet logo on the side. They parked at the end of the driveway, and they walked up to the trailer, and they did not look at the rust on the skirting or the blue tarp on the roof. They looked at Margaret, and they introduced themselves by first names only, and they asked her where the items were located, and Margaret led them to the shed. David Chun had warned her what to expect. She had signed a sheaf of papers the day before at the office of a lawyer named Helen Vargas in Lincoln, whom David Chun had recommended and who had agreed to take Margaret's case on a contingency basis, meaning that Helen would be paid out of the auction proceeds and not before. Helen Vargas was a woman in her late 50s with close-cropped silver hair and half-rimmed reading glasses she wore on a beaded chain around her neck, and she had read through David Chin's preliminary inventory in her office with a completely flat expression and had said, at the end, "Well, Margaret, this is going to be an interesting year." The 2 men from the transport company packed the trunk and all of its contents into a custom-made wooden crate they had brought with them, cushioning each object in archival foam. They did it in 45 minutes. Margaret stood in the shed and watched, and she thought, I should feel something right now. I should feel sad that it is leaving, or nervous that it will not come back, or relieved that it is out of my hands. But she did not feel any of those things. She felt quiet, watchful. She watched the 2 men close the crate and seal it and carry it out to the van, and she watched them slide it into the back of the van and strap it down with heavy nylon straps. And she watched the van doors close, and she watched the van drive away down Muddy Creek Road. And the watching felt like the first adult thing she had done in a long time. She had not fought for it. She had not clung to it. She had let it go, because letting it go was what it needed. And she had trusted the people she had chosen to trust, and she had stood on the cement block steps in the December cold, and she had waved once, briefly, and then she had gone back inside and made herself a cup of tea. Lily came home from school that afternoon and stopped in the doorway of the trailer and sniffed the air and said, "Did you clean the shed, Mom?" And Margaret said, "Yes." And Lily said, "Is the trunk gone?" And Margaret said, "Yes." And Lily nodded, and she did not ask anything else. And the 2 of them ate macaroni and cheese for dinner and did homework at the kitchen counter under the weak bulb, and outside the cottonwoods moved in the wind, and the world held. The weeks that followed were the strangest Margaret had ever lived. On the outside, her life looked exactly the way it had looked for the past 3 months. She waited tables at the Bluebird. She worked her late shift at the gas station twice a week. She drove Lily to school. She paid the propane bill out of her tips. She bought groceries at the dollar store and made stew on Sundays that stretched through Wednesday. She waved at Pauline down the road when their cars passed. She invited Rebecca over for coffee once, and Rebecca sat at the kitchen counter and told her about her husband's complicated feelings regarding his brother, and the conversation was the most normal human exchange Margaret had experienced in weeks, and she was grateful for it in a way that made her chest hurt. On the inside, everything was different. She was a woman with a secret the size of a second life. She had, in a climate-controlled facility in Omaha, an estimated $800,000 to $1.6 million in Gilded Age memorabilia. She had a lawyer in Lincoln who called her every 2 weeks with updates on the provenance research. She had a specialist in Omaha who was, right now, while she refilled coffee cups at the Blue Bird, slowly and carefully authenticating a diary and a pendant and 47 stock certificates and 12 rough sapphires. And she could not tell anybody. Not her daughter, not her friend, not the women at the diner, not her neighbors. Not yet. She bought a laptop. A cheap one, from the electronics store in the next town over, but new in hers. She returned the school laptop to Mrs. Kowalski with a small bouquet of yellow carnations, and Mrs. Kowalski had looked at her over her reading glasses and had said, "Things looking up a little, Mrs. Ellis." And Margaret had said, "A little, yes," which was both true and not true in a way she could not fully explain. She bought Lily a winter coat that actually fit. It was navy blue with a hood lined in fake fur, and it cost $98, which was the most Margaret had spent on a single piece of clothing in 4 years. Lily had come downstairs on the first morning she wore it and had turned in a slow circle in the little living area of the trailer, and she had said, "Does it look okay?" And Margaret had said, "It looks beautiful." And Lily had said, "It's warm, Mom. It's really warm." And Margaret had had to go into the bathroom for a minute and splash water on her face, because she was not going to cry in front of her daughter about a coat. Not today, not ever. But the crying had been in her throat like a hard, small stone. The provenance research took 2 months. Helen Vargas called in the middle of February with the results. The Everton family line from Jeremiah through his wife Margaret and their 3 children had been traced, generation by generation, through parish records and census data and newspaper death notices, down through a grandniece who had married into a family called Reichman in the 1920s, and from there down through another generation to a woman named Elizabeth Reichman, who had married a man named Paul Benson in the 1950s. And from Elizabeth Benson, the trunk had been inherited by her unmarried younger sister, whose name had been Edna Benson, and who had lived the last 41 years of her life in a single-wide trailer on Muddy Creek Road in Redding Falls, Nebraska. There were no other living descendants with a claim on the collection. The line had thinned, and it had ended, and everything had come down to Edna, and Edna had died with no will and no heirs, and her brother Harlan, her half-brother through their mother's second marriage, had inherited what little she had owned, including the trailer and everything inside it. And Harlan had sold the trailer and its contents to Margaret for $10 that he had refused to accept, and that meant, in the unbroken logic of inheritance law, that the trunk and everything in it was, without ambiguity, Margaret's. "It is yours," Helen Vargas said over the phone. "Clear title. No claimants. Mr. Chun can proceed with the auction plan." Margaret sat at the kitchen counter in the trailer and she looked at the little brass key, which she had moved from the coffee mug to a small ceramic dish beside the toaster, and she said, "Thank you, Helen. Don't thank me yet. Thank me in August." "Why August?" "Because that is when we are going to sell the collection. Mr. Chin wants to do it as a dedicated single consignor auction, which is an unusual format, but which he believes will attract the right bidders. He wants 2 months of catalog preparation, 2 months of scholarly press, and a sale in August. So you have 5 more months of waiting." "I can wait 5 more months." "I thought you could." Margaret hung up the phone and she sat very still at the kitchen counter, and she thought about the word yours. She thought about how few things in her life had ever unambiguously belonged to her. Her car, which was dying. Her daughter, whom she did not own but whom the world had entrusted to her. Her father's jacket. Her mother's memory. The $15 she had held in the truck stop parking lot. That was the list. That had been the list. And now there was a trunk. And everything in the trunk. Everything. She did not tell anyone. She kept going to work. She kept making stew on Sundays. The winter gave way to a cold, wet March, and then to a March that was almost warm, and the cottonwoods outside the trailer began to think about putting out leaves, and Margaret watched the earth turn towards spring from the porch of her crooked home, and she felt herself doing something she had almost forgotten how to do, which was waiting for something good. And then, on a Thursday afternoon in late March, her brother Daniel called. Margaret had not spoken to her brother since the reading of the will 7 months ago. She had not, in that time, answered a single one of the text messages he had sent her, which had been few and which had all been versions of the same sentence. "How are you? Checking in. Let me know if you need anything." She had not needed anything from Daniel. She had not wanted anything from Daniel. The silence between them had felt, after the first painful weeks, like a clean thing, like something she had earned. She almost did not answer when his name came up on her phone screen. She was on her lunch break at the Blue Bird, sitting in her car in the gravel lot, eating a grilled cheese sandwich she had made herself at home and brought in a paper bag. She looked at his name on the screen for 3 full rings. Then, because she did not believe in running away from things indefinitely, she picked up. "Daniel." "Maggie." "Hey, it's been a while." "It has. Listen, I have to tell you something, and I want you to hear me out before you get upset." "Okay." Margaret set the grilled cheese down on the passenger seat. Her stomach, which had been hungry a moment ago, went quiet. "Okay, I got a call from a lawyer. In Lincoln. She wouldn't tell me much on the phone, but she said she was representing you in some kind of estate matter, and she wanted to know if I was aware of any family collections of antiques or papers or anything of that nature that might have been inherited through our side of the family. I told her no, because as far as I know, there isn't. But Maggie, I haven't heard from you in 7 months. And then I get a call like that. So I have to ask you, what's going on?" Margaret sat in her car in the gravel lot, and she closed her eyes. Helen had warned her this might happen. Helen had told her that when the auction house released the preliminary press materials in May, Daniel would almost certainly find out, and that before then the provenance research would create paper trails that a determined family member could potentially stumble across. Helen had not expected Daniel to be contacted directly, but apparently a researcher had reached out to confirm that no Everton papers had been passed down through the Ellis side of the family, which they had not, but the phone call itself had been enough to spark Daniel's attention. Margaret opened her eyes. She looked at the Blue Bird through her windshield, at the brown paint and the neon sign that said open even though the O was flickering. She thought about her father's note in her wallet. She thought about her brother's smile in the lawyer's office. She thought about $15. "Daniel," she said, "I found something on the property I bought. That's all I can tell you right now." "What did you find?" "I can't tell you." "Maggie, I can't. Legally, there's a process. It has to play out." "Maggie, is it something valuable?" She thought about lying. She thought about saying no. "It's nothing, a box of old letters. I was curious. I hired a lawyer because I was worried there might be a claim against me." She thought about how easy it would be to make Daniel go away with a small, plausible lie. But she had decided, sometime between Omaha and now, that she was not going to lie anymore. Not to make other people comfortable. Not to protect herself from their reactions. She had spent 41 years lying in small ways so that the men in her family would feel better, and she was not going to do it anymore. Not even now. Not even when lying was the convenient thing. "Yes," she said. "It's valuable. I can't tell you how valuable. I don't fully know yet myself. But yes." There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Margaret could hear the hum of Daniel's car, because he was driving, and he was driving fast. "How valuable, Maggie? I am not going to discuss numbers with you, Daniel. Is this something that was in Dad's house? Something that should have been part of the estate?" "No, it is not. It was on the property I bought. It was in a shed. It had nothing to do with Dad. It had nothing to do with our family. It came from the woman who lived in the trailer before me." "Are you sure about that?" "I am sure. Because if any of that material came out of our family and somehow ended up on that property, that would be estate property, Maggie. That would be something we'd need to look at." Margaret felt a thing happen inside her chest. It was small and hot and clear, and it had been building for 7 months, and maybe for 41 years, and it arrived all at once. "Daniel," she said. Her voice was very calm. "Listen to me carefully. Dad left me $15 and a note. The note said he was giving you everything because you would use it and I would manage. I have managed. I have managed for 7 months in a trailer that cost me $10, in a town I had never heard of, working 2 jobs, raising my daughter, not asking you for anything. Not $1. Not one phone call. And the first time you reach out to me in 7 months is to ask if something I found on my own property might somehow be yours. Do you hear yourself? Maggie, that's not fair. It is exactly fair. It is precisely fair. You took the house, you took the accounts, you took the rental properties, you took the investment portfolio, you took the paintings, you took the silver, you took everything, Daniel. I did not fight you. I did not challenge the will. I did not call a lawyer. I accepted it. I got into my car with my daughter, and I drove away. And now you are calling me because you want to know if what I found in a shed on a lot I bought for $10 might have some connection to our father. Maggie, it does not. And even if it did, which it does not, it would still be mine, because I was the one who looked. You did not look, Daniel. You have never, in your entire life, had to look. Things have always simply come to you. And that is not my problem anymore. It was my problem for 41 years, and it is not my problem anymore. There was another long silence on the phone. She could hear her brother breathing. She could hear the road under his tires. Then he said, I'm going to call you back, Maggie, when you've had time to calm down. I am completely calm, Daniel. I'm going to call you back. He hung up. Margaret sat in her car in the gravel lot of the Bluebird, and she looked at the grilled cheese sandwich on the passenger seat. She picked it up. She took a bite. It was cold, and the bread was slightly soggy where it had been pressed under the paper bag, and it was, in that moment, the most delicious thing she had ever eaten, because she had said out loud, finally, the sentences she had been carrying in her chest for 7 months, and she was not going to unsay them, and she was not going to apologize, and she was not going to wait for her brother to forgive her for having said them. She finished the sandwich. She went back into the Bluebird. She carried plates of eggs for the rest of her shift, and when she got home that night, she called Helen Vargas and she told her what had happened, and Helen had listened without interrupting and then had said, Margaret, I am going to send Mr. Chin a note about this. He may want to move up the timeline. But you did the right thing. You did exactly the right thing. The right thing, Margaret thought later that night, lying in bed beside her sleeping daughter. The right thing. How strange it was, at 41, to do the right thing and have someone tell her so. Daniel called 3 more times over the following 2 weeks. She did not answer. He left voicemails that started cordial and grew, by the 3rd one, into a tone she recognized from their father, a tone of aggrieved adult reasonableness, the tone of a man explaining to an unreasonable woman why her unreasonableness was hurting everyone around her. Margaret listened to the voicemails once each and then deleted them. She did not respond. She did not call him back. She went to work, and she came home, and she helped her daughter with her homework, and she waited. David Chin called on a Monday morning in mid-April. Margaret was at the gas station, working the late shift, and she stepped outside to take the call in the cold spring wind. Mrs. Ellis, how are you? I am well, Mr. Chun. How are you? I have news. The catalog is finished. The press embargo lifts on May the 15th. We are going to announce the sale with a full-page feature in the New York Times and an article in the Wall Street Journal, along with pieces in 3 scholarly journals. I wanted you to hear from me before any of that happened. The auction is scheduled for August the 21st in Omaha. I would like you to come. To the auction? Yes. Your presence is not required. You will receive the same result whether you are in the room or not. But I would like you to come, because I think you should see it. I think you should be in the room when this happens. I think it is important. Margaret leaned against the brick wall of the gas station and looked up at the sky, which was a pale and clean blue, and she thought about August, and she thought about a room, and she thought about being in that room. I will come, she said. Good. I will send you the details. And Mrs. Ellis? Yes. My final estimate on the aggregate value of the collection, now that the authentication and scholarly vetting is complete, is $1.4 million on the low end and $2.2 million on the high end. I am no longer being conservative. Margaret closed her eyes. The wind moved through her hair. She could hear a truck going past on the highway a quarter mile away. Thank you, Mr. Chun. Thank you, Mrs. Ellis, for trusting me. This has been a tremendous honor. The press hit on May the 15th, as promised. Margaret did not read the New York Times that day. She did not read the Wall Street Journal. She knew what they said, because David Chun had sent her the articles in advance, and she had read them once each. And she had closed the laptop and gone outside and sat on the porch of the trailer until the sun had gone down. But other people read the articles. And that was when the telephone started to ring. The first call was from a reporter at the Omaha World-Herald who wanted an interview. Margaret declined politely. The second call was from a morning news show in Lincoln. The third was from a freelance journalist working on a story for a national magazine. The fourth, fifth, and sixth were all different variations of the same request, and Margaret declined them all because David Chun had advised her to, and because she did not want to be a story, and because she was still, at the end of the day, a waitress at a diner on Highway 11, and she was going to finish the spring and the summer doing what she had been doing, and she was not going to turn her life into a performance for strangers. But the town found out. Of course the town found out. There is no such thing as a national news story breaking about a local woman in a local town without the local town reading it too. Margaret came into her shift at the Blue Bird on the morning of May the 16th, and she could feel the room change when she walked in. Earl looked at her from behind the counter, and he did not smile, and he did not frown, and he said, "Maggie," in his office. 5 minutes. And she had put down her things, and she had followed him, and he had sat behind his cluttered desk, and he had looked at her, and he had said, "Is it true? Is what true? Is it true what the paper says? About the trunk? About the money? About all of it?" "Yes." Earl chewed his toothpick. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Why are you here, Maggie?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, you're about to be worth more money than most people in this county will earn in a lifetime. And you're in my back office at 6:15 in the morning about to go pour coffee for Hank Delaney." "Why?" Margaret thought about it. She thought about it honestly, because Earl deserved an honest answer, and because the question was a real question, and because she had asked herself the same thing in the mirror that morning. "Because the auction is not until August, Earl, and nothing is real until August. And I have a daughter to feed between now and August. And I don't know how to be anything other than what I am, and I will figure that out when I have to figure it out. But I am not going to stop being a waitress until there is a reason to stop. And I like working here. I like you. I like the women on my shift. I like knowing where I need to be at 6 in the morning. So until something changes, I am going to be a waitress at the Blue Bird." Earl looked at her for another long moment. Then he smiled, just a little, around the toothpick. "All right, Maggie," he said. "Get out there. Table 6 wants coffee." She worked her shift. The customers looked at her differently. Some of them pretended not to know, which she appreciated. Some of them made jokes that were not unkind, about her being rich, about how she should buy the diner, about how she was going to leave them all for a yacht. She laughed along with the jokes where she could, and she deflected them where she could not, and she poured coffee, and at the end of her shift she drove home with her tips in an envelope, and her feet aching the way they always ached. And Lily was waiting on the front steps of the trailer in her navy blue coat, and Lily looked up at her and said, "Hi, Mom. How was work?" And Margaret said, "It was good, baby. It was good." And that, Margaret thought, was going to be the answer, somehow. That was going to be the answer to everything that was coming. "How was work?" "It was good." "How are you?" "I am good." "How is Lily?" "She is good." The ordinary sentences. The small ordinary sentences that had held her life together through the worst of it were going to have to hold her life together through whatever was coming next, too, because she was not going to become someone new just because she had money. She was going to be the same woman she had been, only with different problems and different gifts, and a slightly easier version of the same stubbornness. The town shifted around her. Pauline came by with another casserole and stayed for coffee and apologized, in her own way, for the coolness of the previous months, and Margaret let her apologize, and they drank coffee together, and they did not fully become friends, but they became something, which was more than they had been. Rebecca did not change at all, which Margaret loved her for. Earl did not change at all either, which Margaret loved him for in a different way. Daniel stopped calling. That was the strangest thing. After the news broke, after the number became public, after the scale of what she had found was not just a family rumor, but an international news story, Daniel went quiet. Margaret did not know what to make of it. Maybe he had been told by his lawyer to stay away, because Helen Vargas had sent him a letter on May the 16th informing him that any legal challenge to the collection would be unsuccessful and would be pursued vigorously at his expense. Maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe he was waiting for her to reach out and make it easier for him. Margaret did not care which it was. She did not reach out. She was done managing her brother's feelings. She had her own life to live, and it was, finally, full enough that she did not have space for his. The summer came slowly, and then all at once. The Nebraska heat settled down over the trailer in late June, and Margaret bought a window air conditioner with her tips. And the installation of the window air conditioner was a small ceremony of its own, because Margaret had not had air conditioning in 4 years, and Lily had never, in her 11 years of life, lived somewhere with a window unit that actually worked. The first night they ran it, Lily lay on the living area bench with her arms stretched out and her eyes closed, and she said, "Mom, this is the greatest night of my life." And Margaret laughed until she almost cried, because her daughter's greatest night of her life had been a $54 window unit from the hardware store, and because that was about to change, in ways Margaret was not sure her daughter was prepared for. They had a conversation about it. One night in July, with the air conditioner humming in the window and Lily in her pajamas and the cottonwoods black against the summer sky outside, Margaret sat down on the bench next to her daughter, and she said, "Baby, I need to tell you some things about what's going to happen next." Lily looked up from her book. "About the auction." "Yes." "How much is it?" Margaret hesitated. She had not told Lily the number. Lily had never asked. But Lily was 11, and Lily was smart, and Lily had seen the look on the cashier's face at the hardware store when Margaret had paid for the air conditioner in cash. "It's going to be a lot," Margaret said. "Mr. Chin thinks it's going to be between $1 and $2 million. Maybe more." Lily's eyes widened. She did not say anything for a moment. "Is that our money?" "That's our money. After taxes and the auction house fees, it's going to be less than that. But it's our money. Are we going to move? Do you want to move?" Lily thought about it. She looked around the little living area of the trailer, at the patched wall by the bedroom door, at the window unit in the window, at the lamp Margaret had bought at a thrift store for $3, and the photograph of Margaret's mother in the yellow dress that sat next to it. "Not yet," Lily said. "Not yet. I like it here. I like my school. I like Hannah and Olivia and the way my room looks. I don't want to move in the middle of 6th grade. That would be terrible." Margaret laughed. "All right. Not yet. We will not move in the middle of 6th grade. We will stay right here. Are we going to buy a bigger house eventually?" "Eventually. When you're ready. When you tell me you're ready. And it's going to be close by?" "It's going to be in Reading Falls, or close to Reading Falls, because you are going to stay at that school, and I am going to figure out what to do with my life, and we are going to do it all here." "Are you going to stop working at the Bluebird?" "I think I am. Not right away. I will work there through the auction. But after that, I think I am going to go back to school." "For what?" Margaret had been thinking about this. In the long, quiet months of waiting, when her hands had been busy with plates and coffee cups, but her mind had been free, she had been thinking about what she had actually been good at before her life had narrowed to bookkeeping and waitressing, about what she had once wanted to do when she was 17, before she had folded herself into the shape her family had required. She had wanted to study history. She had wanted to work in archives. She had wanted to handle old things and understand them, the way David Chin did. And she had given that up because her father had said it was not practical, and her brother had said she would be bored, and her mother had been dead and had not been there to tell her to do it anyway. "I want to study history," she said to her daughter. "I want to work with old things. I want to help other people find out what's in their trunks." Lily grinned. "That's cool, Mom." "Is it?" "Yeah, that's really cool." Margaret put her arm around her daughter, and they sat together on the bench in the little living area with the window air conditioner humming, and outside the night was warm and full of insects, and Margaret thought, "This is the life. This, right here. The window unit and the daughter and the conversation about what I want to do next. This is what I am going to use the money for. Not to become a different woman. To become the woman I was supposed to become before everything got in the way." August the 21st came on a Wednesday. Margaret drove to Omaha in a rented car because the Honda had finally given up in late July and she had not yet replaced it. And she wore the only dress she owned that was appropriate for a professional event, a navy blue sheath she had bought at a consignment shop in Lincoln for $38. Lily was with her. Lily was wearing a dress too, a green one Margaret had bought her at the same consignment shop, and her hair was in a braid, and she sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap in a way that made her look, suddenly, older than 11. The auction house had reserved seats for them in the front row. David Chin met them at the door. He introduced Margaret to a small circle of his colleagues, and then he led her and Lily to their seats, and he smiled at Lily and told her she looked very grown up, and Lily had blushed and had whispered to her mother afterward, "Mom, he is a nice man." The room was full. 150 chairs, all of them occupied. Buyers, scholars, journalists, institutional representatives from 3 universities and 2 major museums. Margaret sat with her daughter beside her, and she did not look at the room. She looked at the lot catalog in her lap, which was a thick, glossy book with photographs of every item from the trunk, and essays about Jeremiah Everton, and reproductions of the diary pages, and she thought, "This is what David Chun has been doing for 5 months. This is how much care he has taken with my family that was not my family." The auction began at 2 in the afternoon. The auctioneer was a tall woman with a clean silver bob, and her voice was clear and patient, and she worked through the lots one by one, and the numbers climbed higher than Margaret had dared to expect. The stock certificate sold as a single lot for $137,000 to a collector in New York. The sapphires, which Margaret had barely thought about in 8 months, sold for $44,000 to a jeweler in London who was bidding by phone. The pocket watch went for $9,200. The miniature of the sad-eyed woman went for $11,500 to a museum in Connecticut that specialized in American portraiture. The emerald pendant came up as Lot 12. The bidding started at $40,000. It climbed in increments of $5,000, then $10,000, then $20,000, as 2 bidders, one in the room and one on the phone, fought over it. It sold, eventually, for $148,000 to a private collector in Geneva whose name was not announced, and when the hammer fell, the room broke into a small, polite round of applause, and Lily looked up at her mother and whispered, "Mom, that's a lot of money for a necklace," and Margaret nodded, and she could not speak, because if she spoke she would cry. The diary came up as Lot 23, the final lot. The auctioneer read the description herself, in a voice that was almost reverent. The personal journal of Jeremiah Everton, covering the years 1889 through his death in 1903, with contemporaneous entries on financial transactions, family events, and the political climate of the late Gilded Age. A primary source of significant scholarly importance. The bidding opened at $50,000. It sold for $298,000 to the University of Pennsylvania Library, where it would be cataloged and digitized and made available to researchers, and where it would, David Chun had told her once, be used in studies for another 150 years. When the hammer fell for the final time, the room rose. Not a standing ovation for anyone in particular, but the natural rising of 150 people after 2 hours of sitting, the shuffling and gathering and quiet voices that follow a long and successful auction. Margaret rose too, because everyone else was rising, and she found that she was holding Lily's hand without remembering when she had taken it. David Chun came to her. He was smiling. "Mrs. Ellis," he said. "Mr. Chun, the total, before fees and taxes, is $1,973,000. Your net, after everything, will be approximately $1,400,000. Margaret looked at him. She looked at her daughter. She looked at the room full of people who were packing up and talking among themselves and leaving, none of whom had any idea that the quiet woman in the navy dress in the front row was the whole reason any of them had been in that room. $1.4 million, she said. "Yes, that is a lot of money. It is a lot of money, Mrs. Ellis." "Thank you. You are welcome." She drove home that night. 3 hours back to Redding Falls, through the Nebraska dark, with her daughter asleep in the passenger seat and her hands on the steering wheel of the rented car, and she did not cry, and she did not laugh, and she did not feel any of the things she had thought she might feel. She felt very calm. She felt very awake. She felt that she had been waiting for a long time, and that the waiting was finally over, and that what came next was up to her, and that what came next was going to be, for the first time in her life, a thing she got to design from the ground up. She pulled into the driveway of the trailer at a little after 11. The cottonwoods were still, because the night was still. She carried Lily inside and put her to bed in her clothes, and she took off her own dress, and she sat at the kitchen counter under the single weak bulb in the kitchen that she had still not replaced, and she looked at the small brass key in the ceramic dish by the toaster. She picked up the key. She held it in her palm. She thought about a woman named Edna who had carried this key on a ring for 41 years and had never tried the lock. She thought about a man named Harlan who had handed this key to a stranger because a stranger had looked kind. She thought about a specialist named David Chun who had opened the box and had not tried to take anything from her. She thought about a lawyer named Helen Vargas who had protected her from her brother. She thought about her daughter, sleeping in the next room in a green consignment shop dress. She thought about her father's note. She took it out of her wallet, where it had sat for 8 months, and she unfolded it, and she read it again. Maggie, I know this will come as a hurt to you. Your brother has been my partner in the business since he was 20, and he has built more of what we have than you know. The house and the accounts have to go to him because the business cannot be split. You were the best daughter I could have asked for, Maggie. You were the kindest of us. But you don't need what Daniel needs, and I have tried to give what I had to the one who would use it most. I hope you understand. I love you. Your father. Margaret read the note. She folded it. She did not throw it away. She put it back in her wallet, where it had lived, and where it would continue to live, because whatever her father had meant and whatever his reasons had been, he had loved her in his way, and she was done fighting with the dead. The living had enough fights in them. She put the small brass key back in the ceramic dish. She went to bed. In the year that followed, Margaret did the things she had told herself she would do. She enrolled, part-time, in a history program at a small college in Lincoln, commuting once a week and doing the rest of her coursework online. She bought a better car, a used Toyota with good tires. She set up a college fund for Lily. She paid off the remaining $14 of back taxes on the trailer lot, and she kept the trailer, which had become, in her mind, a small and unlikely monument to the woman she had been. She fixed it up slowly. New skirting, new windows, a proper roof instead of the blue tarp. She did not move out of it, not yet, because Lily had asked her not to, and because she had learned to trust her daughter's instincts. She bought a house 2 years later, a small brick 2-bedroom on a quiet street in Redding Falls, and she kept the trailer anyway. She used it as an office, and a place to write, and a place to go when she needed to remember what the world had looked like from the inside of $5 and a 97-mile tank of gas. She reconnected with Daniel, eventually, not because she forgave him, exactly, but because he was her only sibling, and because Lily had asked her once, quietly, if she had an uncle anywhere, and because Margaret had decided that the next generation did not have to inherit her grievances. The reconnection was careful and small. A phone call on a birthday. A holiday card. Nothing that would pretend the past had not happened, but nothing that would close the door forever either. Daniel, for his part, was humbler than he had been. Maybe the news of the auction had rearranged something in him. Maybe time had. Margaret did not pry. She thought about Edna often. The woman who had lived on Muddy Creek Road for 41 years. The woman who had carried the small key on her ring. The woman who had pressed flowers into baseboards. Margaret planted a small garden behind the trailer in the 3rd spring, and she put in yellow flowers because she had noticed that the faded miniatures of her mother had been wearing yellow, and because the woman in the other miniature, the one that had been called Mother, had had the same patient face her own mother had worn, and because grief is a thing that moves between generations and between strangers, and because Margaret had come to believe that she and Edna had been, somehow, the same woman in 2 different lives, and that she was living the life Edna had almost lived, and that she owed Edna something she would never be able to repay. She kept the small brass key. She kept it in the ceramic dish by the toaster, for years, long after the trunk was gone and the money was settled, and the life she had built had become a life she recognized. She kept it because every time she looked at it she remembered something important, which was that locked things in your life often have keys you are already carrying, and that you have to be the person who tries the locks, and that nobody is going to try the locks for you. Lily grew up. She went to high school. She went to college. She studied, of all things, art conservation, which she told her mother one evening at dinner when she was 16, and Margaret had smiled and had not said anything, because she did not need to. Her daughter had found her own trunks to open, and that was as it should be. And on summer nights, sometimes, Margaret went back out to the old trailer. She would sit on the cement block steps as the Nebraska sun went down, and she would think about a truck stop bulletin board, and a flyer with a phone number, and an old man in a plaid shirt who had said, "Wait till you live here a winter." And she would think about how she had. She had lived here a winter, and a spring, and a summer, and another winter, and then a life. And the life had not turned out to be the one she had been told to expect. The life had turned out to be the one she had built. One scrubbed baseboard, and one tried key, and one refused phone call at a time. She thought, on those summer evenings, about the poor, and about what the poor know that the comfortable do not. The poor know that every locked thing has a key. The poor know that every shed has a trunk. The poor know that you cannot afford to stop looking. And once in a while, not always, not even often, but once in a while, looking is enough. The trunk opens. The bundle unwraps. The life turns. There was a night, in the 5th summer after the auction, when Margaret sat on the cement block steps of the old trailer and Lily sat beside her. Lily was 16 now. She was taller than her mother by 2 inches, which Margaret could not get used to, and she was home from her summer program at a museum in Chicago, and she had driven out to the trailer with her mother on a whim, because she had wanted to. The two of them sat together in the blue dusk, and Lily was eating a popsicle, and Margaret was drinking a glass of iced tea, and for a long time neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said. Then Lily, looking out across the half-acre lot at the cottonwoods where the first fireflies were beginning to rise, said, "Mom, did you ever think we wouldn't make it? Back when we first came here." Margaret thought about it honestly. That was the one thing she owed her daughter more than anything else. She had decided a long time ago. Honest answers to honest questions. It was the one debt she would never stop paying. "Yes," she said. "I did. I thought it most nights. I thought it the first week we were in the trailer, when I realized the propane was going to run out before I could afford to refill it. I thought it on the drive to Omaha the first time, when I didn't know if David Chun was going to be a real person or a polite fraud. I thought it every time the Honda made a noise I didn't recognize. I was afraid, baby. I was afraid the whole time. You never told me." "No," Margaret said. "I didn't. Because you didn't need to know. You needed to be a kid, and you needed to have a mom who could look like she knew what she was doing, even when she didn't. That was the job. The job of being a mother, for me anyway, was to carry the fear so you didn't have to." Lily looked at her. Her daughter's face, in the dusk, was the face of the woman she was becoming, a woman Margaret did not yet fully know, but whom she trusted in the deep, instinctive way a mother trusts the person she has watched grow. "Were you lonely?" Lily said. "Yes." "Are you still lonely?" Margaret considered this. "Less," she said. "A lot less. Not because anything dramatic has changed. Not because I have a partner, because I don't. But because I know how to be alone now without it feeling like failure. There's a difference, baby, between being alone and being lonely. It took me most of my life to figure that out, but I figured it out eventually." Lily nodded. She did not say anything for a while. She ate the last of her popsicle, and she tossed the stick into the grass, which Margaret would have corrected her about in any other circumstance, but did not, because the moment was too quiet to interrupt with small corrections. "Mom," Lily said. "Yes. I'm really glad you saw that flyer." "Me too, baby. I'm really glad you picked up the phone." "Me too." And that, Margaret thought, was the whole story. That was what it came down to. A flyer on a bulletin board. A phone call to a stranger. A trunk in a shed. A key in a pocket. And a daughter, 5 summers later, saying the words that a mother waits her entire life to hear. "I'm glad you picked up the phone. I'm glad you did what you did. I'm glad you got us here." The fireflies rose in the lot. Somewhere far off, a dog barked. The last of the light went out of the Nebraska sky, and Margaret Ellis, who had once held $15 in her palm in the parking lot of a truck stop, sat on the steps of a trailer she had bought for no money at all and looked out at the world she had built, piece by piece, out of the one thing she had never stopped having, which was the stubborn refusal to stop looking. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you will really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.